The audio file was exactly 42 seconds long. To a passing listener, or perhaps a standard police wiretap transcriber making minimum wage for the city, the heavily encrypted recording sounded like nothing more than aggressive static punctuated by a rhythmic scratching sound. It resembled generic interference, but it was actually the encrypted heartbeat of a burner phone, desperately searching for a cell tower. It was white noise, garbage audio, something to be instantly discarded or categorized as corrupted data by anyone lacking the patience to dig deeper into the digital mud. But I was not a standard transcriber, and the people quietly funding my existence did not deal in garbage. Information was currency, and in the sprawling, blood-soaked economy of the Boston underworld, Nicholas Archetti was the Federal Reserve. They dealt in leverage, and I was the mechanism that extracted it. I pressed the heavy foam pads of my professional-grade headphones tighter against my ears, shutting out the relentless winter wind, rattling the poorly sealed window of my apartment. The cold here was a physical entity, a living, breathing predator that seeped through the cracks in the masonry, sliding over the cracked linoleum floor to wrap around my ankles like an icy shackle. I ignored it, burying my lower face deeper into the thick collar of my oversized cream sweater. My fingers hovered over the keyboard with a practiced, surgical stillness. The dual monitors of my workstation cast a harsh, clinical blue light across my tired features. On the left screen, the spectrogram of the audio file displayed a jagged neon green topographical map of sound frequencies against a pitch-black background. On the adjacent monitor, my coded wiretap ledger remained terrifyingly blank. For 6 uninterrupted hours, I had been dismantling those 2 seconds of sound. I had mapped the ambient noise floor, isolating the distinctive hum of a faulty 60 Hz electrical transformer in the background. A precise acoustic signature that placed the caller within a specific, poorly maintained industrial grid in the south end. I applied a spectral subtraction algorithm to carefully strip away the biting interference of the winter wind tearing across the caller's phone microphone. Then came the tedious, painstaking process of phase vocoding, stretching the compressed syllables by micronemesis without altering their native pitch. It was my job, a highly specialized, intensely solitary shadow profession that kept me completely hidden from the world. Forensic linguistics and acoustic phonetics. Before my life violently imploded, I was the woman highly paid corporate lawyers brought in to prove that a recorded voice did not match their client. Now, I was the woman a syndicate boss paid to prove exactly who was plotting against him in the dark. It was a terrifying fall from grace, but it paid in untraceable cash. At this exact moment, cash was the only thing keeping a roof over my head and a locked door between me and the monster I was hiding from. I adjusted the digital equalizer, dragging the low-frequency threshold down to completely eliminate the background drone. I boosted the 3000 Hz range, cutting through the heavy digital scrambling layer that the caller had mistakenly thought would protect his identity. The ambient rumble vanished. The metallic distortion smoothed out. Instantly, the audio profile shifted from chaotic noise to an intimate, terrifyingly clear acoustic environment. I hit the spacebar. The isolated track played. There it was, a voice. The human voice is a biometric fingerprint. You cannot truly disguise it unless you understand the physiological mechanics of your own vocal tract. People think they can just lower their pitch or muffle their mouths with fabric. They are wrong. Your glottal stops, the specific resonance of your nasal cavity, the micro tremors in your vocal cords when pushing air, these things betray you on a spectrogram. I watched the green topographical peaks dance on my left monitor as the man spoke. It was faint, buried under the hiss of wind, but the cadence was unmistakable. A man speaking rapid, hushed syndicate dialect, specifically the southern regional dialect. But there was something fundamentally wrong with the vowels. They were too sharp, too deeply formed in the back of the throat. The rhythm was entirely off. My heart rate kicked up a steady, calculated notch. I paused the track, isolated a single 3-second waveform, and amplified the vocal gain. Il carico arriva a mezzanotte. Nessun superstite. The shipment arrives at midnight. No survivors. This translation itself was dangerous enough to warrant an immediate execution in this city. But the real value of my work was not in the raw words. It was in the anatomy of the sound. I listened closely to the breath intake before the noun was spoken. It was heavy, a distinct wheeze indicating early-stage respiratory damage, likely from unfiltered tobacco. I catalogued the micropause between the subject and the predicate, a hesitation that betrayed unfamiliarity with the linguistic structure. More importantly, the phonetic clipping on the double consonants was not native at all. It was a foreign Eastern inflection. I analyzed the pitch contours, the subtle flattening of the vowels that only occurred when someone was translating thoughts from a separate linguistic base into a new language in real time. An Eastern operative attempting to speak the regional dialect over a burner phone to frame a rival syndicate crew for a midnight ambush. Sloppy, desperate, and ultimately fatal. I typed the exact phonetic breakdown into my encrypted ledger, my fingers flying across the keys with clinical precision. I noted the stress on the syllables, the slight hesitation before the verb, and the distinct respiratory wheeze. I cross-referenced the dialect markers with known syndicate linguistic profiles, mathematically proving that the speaker was an imposter. I knew exactly what I was doing. Every keystroke was a nail in the coffin of the man on that recording, but I felt no pity. In my world, pity was a luxury reserved for people who had emergency funds, clean credit scores, and locks that actually held against a crowbar. I had none of those things. I finalized the translation, appended my linguistic and anomaly report regarding the foreign accent, and attached the clean, filtered audio file. My cursor hovered over the submit button on the secure, heavily encrypted dark web portal. Once I clicked it, the data would bounce through 6 proxy servers, routed through hidden IP addresses overseas, before landing directly on the desk of my employer, Nicholas Urquetti. Even thinking his name in the suffocating silence of my freezing apartment felt like inviting a ghost into the room. He was a myth as much as he was a man. As the head of the Urquetti syndicate, his empire was built on ruthless efficiency, absolute discretion, and a terrifyingly calm demeanor. I had done my research when the encrypted recruitment email first bypassed my firewalls. Nicholas did not yell. He did not make empty threats. He did not leave collateral damage. He simply removed obstacles with the cold, calculated precision of a surgeon, amputating a rotting limb. He was the apex predator of the city, a man who viewed the entire eastern seaboard as his personal chessboard. But to me, he was just a secure cryptocurrency deposit every Friday at midnight. A faceless, terrifying entity who paid flawlessly for my perfection. I had never met him. I had never spoken his name out loud. Our entire relationship consisted of encrypted drops and massive deposits that allowed me to pay my extortionate medical debts under the table. I was a ghost working for a god, and that was exactly how I needed it to stay. I've been invisible for 8 months. No social footprint. No registered address in my real name. No paper trail that could lead back to the shattered, violent life I had fled. Just cash transactions, a fake name on my lease, and a somatic hypervigilance that lived constantly in the back of my throat like the taste of copper. I clicked send. The progress bar filled instantly. File sent. I exhaled a long, shaky breath that misted faintly in the freezing air of the room and ripped the heavy headphones off my ears. The sudden absence of the intense audio scrutiny left my head ringing. The physical reality of the apartment rushed back in to fill the void. The dripping of the leaky kitchen faucet, the hum of the dying refrigerator, struggling to keep my meager groceries cold, the distant, mournful wail of a police siren 3 streets over. I rubbed my dry, burning eyes with the heels of my hands, the rough texture of my sleeves scraping against my skin. My lower back ached with a dull, throbbing intensity from sitting hunched over the glowing monitors for hours. The vertebrae popped in loud, satisfying succession as I pushed my chair back, the metal wheels grinding harshly against the cracked linoleum floor. The job was done. The target was acquired. My employer would have his answer, and I would have my rent money. But the adrenaline crash left me hollow, shivering, and acutely aware of the overwhelming silence of the 4 thin walls keeping the world at bay. I walked slowly into the kitchen, a depressing little alcove featuring peeling yellow wallpaper, and a single overhead fluorescent bulb that buzzed like an angry hornet. I did not turn it on. I preferred the semi-darkness, navigating by the ambient streetlight that filtered through the narrow, uncurtained window above the sink. I could hear the faint, muffled sounds of Mr. Vance, my elderly neighbor across the hall, shuffling around his unit. He was a nosy man who often complained about late-night footsteps, striking his cane against the shared wall when the floorboards creaked too loudly, but he stayed out of trouble. His predictable routines was one of the few things that grounded me in reality, making him the ideal neighbor for someone trying to remain utterly unseen. If someone violently breached my door, I knew Mr. Vance would simply turn up his television and look the other way. That was the unwritten rule of this neighborhood. I turned the tap, waiting for the water to transition from freezing to merely cold, and splashed my face. The shock of it made me gasp. I grabbed a rough paper towel and patted my skin dry, staring blankly at the dark window pane. Because there were no lights on inside, the glass acted as a mirror, reflecting my own exhausted silhouette back at me. Dark circles bruised the fragile skin under my eyes. My dark hair was pulled into a messy, utilitarian knot at the nape of my neck. I looked exactly like what I was, a professional survivor running on fumes and paranoia. Suddenly, my cracked smartphone resting on the chipped countertop vibrated, emitting a harsh, staccato buzz that made my entire body flinch. Somatic hypervigilance. My therapist used to call it that, back when I could afford one. The physical inability to differentiate between a harmless notification and an imminent threat. The way my lungs locked up and my vision tunneled into a pinpoint of raw panic. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs, a frantic bird-like flutter, as I stared at the dark screen, waiting for it to light up again. It buzzed twice more in rapid succession. I reached out, my fingers stiff and trembling slightly from the ambient cold, and picked it up. The shattered glass of the screen protector scraped familiarly against my thumb as I unlocked it. 3 missed messages from an encrypted chat app. Elena, Maya, please tell me you are okay. You have not replied since Tuesday. I am starting to panic. If I do not hear from you in 10 minutes, I am calling the police. I swear to God. I squeezed my eyes shut, a heavy wave of guilt settling back onto my shoulders like a familiar suffocating blanket. Elena Lynn. My younger sister. The only piece of my past I had not been able to surgically sever. She was 3 states away, living in a secure, well-lit university dorm, completely insulated from the dark, blood-stained reality I navigated daily to pay her out-of-state tuition. I had promised her I would check in every 48 hours. It was our strict protocol. A necessary fail-safe established after the night I showed up at her apartment in the pouring rain. Covered in purple bruises I could not explain, shoved a wad of cash into her hands, and told her I was disappearing. She knew I was hiding. She knew the abusive ex-husband, who had nearly ended my life, was still out there, possessing enough corrupt connections to make tracking me a viable threat. What she did not know was that I was currently translating hit lists for a syndicate boss to fund our survival. Loved ones are targets, liabilities. Anyone in my position knows better than to give the world that kind of leverage. My ex-husband had taught me that lesson with a heavy fist and a locked door. He had systematically dismantled my confidence, isolating me until my only escape was a desperate run into the night, with nothing but the clothes on my back and a bruised face. Now, every unfamiliar noise in the hallway made my blood run cold. But Elena was blood. She was the tether keeping me from drifting entirely into the abyss of this shadow life. Her fear was valid, and my silence was cruel. I quickly typed out a reply on the cracked smartphone. I am here, Elena. I am sorry. I just got slammed with a massive freelance translation project. Deadline was brutal. I watched the screen intently. The 3 little typing dots appeared almost instantly. Words are not enough, Maya. Send me a picture. Currently. Prove you are not lying in a ditch somewhere. I let out a soft, defeated sigh. She was relentless. But I could not blame her. The trauma of the past year had wired her anxiety just as tightly as it had wired my own paranoia. A text message could be typed by anyone holding my unlocked phone. A photo was undeniable proof of life. I looked around the dismal kitchen. If I sent her a picture of this peeling wallpaper and the cracked linoleum, she would panic for an entirely different reason. She thought I was living in a secure, upscale corporate housing unit provided by a legitimate translation firm. I needed to frame the shot perfectly to maintain the lie. I stepped back, positioning myself directly in front of the sink, putting my back to the dark, uncurtained window. The darkness outside would serve as a solid black backdrop, obscuring the grimy brick wall of the alleyway behind my building. I reached up and finally flicked on the small, warm-toned under-cabinet light. It cast a soft, golden glow over my face, hiding the worst of the exhaustion shadows and making my oversized sweater look cozy, rather than a desperate defense against the draft. I lifted the phone, angling it slightly downward to avoid catching the damaged ceiling plaster in the frame. I forced the muscles in my face to relax, hiding the tension that had become my default resting state. I curved my lips into a gentle, reassuring smile, the kind of expression an older sister gives to a younger one to say, "Everything is handled. You are safe. I am safe." I snapped the photo. The shutter clicked, a sharp, artificial sound in the quiet room. I did not bother reviewing it closely. I was too exhausted to care about the bags under my eyes or the messy state of my hair. I just checked to make sure my face was clear and the background was adequately dark, then hit send on the secure app. See? Just tired, Elena. Go to sleep. I love you. I stood there in the quiet kitchen, the screen of my cheap smartphone glowing in the dark apartment, casting a blue hue over the cracked linoleum. I watched the status change to delivered, and then, a few seconds later, read, "You look exhausted, but alive. Love you too. Call me tomorrow." A profound sense of relief washed over me, loosening the tight coil of anxiety in my chest. I had successfully managed her fear. The crisis was averted. The lie was maintained. I locked the device and set it face down on the counter, staring out at the pitch-black glass of the window in front of me. I was so tired. The cold was seeping deep into my bones, and my bed, a lumpy, second-hand mattress on the floor of the adjacent room, was calling my name with a magnetic pull. I just needed to sleep. I just needed to close my eyes, quiet the relentless analytical machinery of my brain, and pretend, just for a few hours, that I was a normal woman with a normal, boring life. I reached out to turn off the under-cabinet light. I had posted it, just a simple, tired smile to let my sister know I survived the double shift. It was entirely innocent, an encrypted message sent over a secure channel, meant for one pair of eyes only. I had no idea that when I stood with my back to that uncurtained window, the soft golden light had illuminated my face perfectly, effectively turning the cheap glass behind me into a mirror against the dark night. I had not looked closely at the photograph before hitting send. I had not zoomed in on the upper corner of the frame, where the dark silhouette of the alleyway was supposed to be completely empty. If I had possessed the energy to analyze my own photograph the way I analyzed audio files, I would have seen the reflection. I would have seen the distinct, broad-shouldered outline of a man standing completely motionless in the shadows of the fire escape directly across from my apartment. A man who was watching me through the glass. A cold, vindictive syndicate hitman named Dante Drago, tracking me to exploit my existence as a liability against the Urquetti family. I turned off the light, plunging the kitchen back into heavy darkness, completely oblivious to the fact that my invisible, carefully constructed life had just been shattered by a single innocent selfie. I walked away from the window, pulling the oversized cream sweater tighter around my body to ward off the chill, believing I was entirely alone. 10 minutes later, the deadbolt on my front door clicked. It did not rattle from a heavy knock. It did not shake from a violent impact. It simply disengaged with a terrifying, precise metallic snap that echoed through the freezing silence of my living space. The brass cylinder turned smoothly from the outside, entirely bypassing my pathetic security measures as if they were made of paper. The chain lock, my last line of defense, slid out of its track with a soft metallic scrape. My breath caught in my throat. I froze in the center of the cracked linoleum floor, my muscles locking into an immediate, primal state of terror. The heavy wooden door swung open silently, letting a violent rush of freezing hallway air sweep into the room, carrying with it the faint smell of ozone and impending violence. A towering shadow stepped directly into my dark apartment, a massive, untouchable force that instantly consumed all the oxygen in the room. He moved with a lethal, terrifying grace, carrying the scent of winter wind, cedar, and expensive leather. It was Nicholas Urquetti. He did not cross the threshold in a rush. There was no chaotic surge of violence, no kicked-in doorframe, no shouted commands echoing down the grim hallway. Instead, the man who controlled the entire eastern seaboard's shadow economy simply stopped just inside my entryway. He raised his right hand, the supple black leather of his bespoke glove, creaking with a soft, expensive sound, and delivered a heavy, rattling knock against the splintered wood of the doorframe he had already breached. It was a dark, calculated mockery of permission, a physical reminder that locks, chains, and boundaries were merely polite suggestions to a man of his immense, untouchable power. I stood completely frozen, in the center of the kitchen, my cracked smartphone still resting on the chipped counter behind me. The sudden drop in temperature wasn't just environmental. It was a visceral, violent reaction spreading outward from my core. The fine hairs on my arms stood on end beneath the oversized cream sweater I wore. My sympathetic nervous system, permanently damaged by a year of running from my abusive ex-husband, immediately flooded my bloodstream with cortisol. It turned the blood in my veins to ice water. I could feel the erratic, frantic thud of my pulse, hammering against the delicate skin of my throat, vibrating so hard it made my vision blur at the edges. I had spent 8 months cultivating total invisibility. I had engineered a life built on encrypted servers, untraceable cryptocurrency drops, and a fake name on a legally binding lease. Yet here he was, the apex predator himself, standing on my cracked linoleum floor. My brain, desperate to regain control over my failing body, immediately snapped into the clinical analytical framework that had kept me alive this long. I began a rapid, involuntary risk assessment of the entity occupying my space. At a glance, the physical geometry of the room offered a 0% probability of evasion. The distance from my position by the sink to the open doorway was exactly 14 feet. The syndicate head occupied the entire frame. He was massive, easily over 6'3", with a breadth of shoulder that seemed to block out the ambient yellow light from the corridor behind him. His wingspan alone, currently resting relaxed at his sides beneath the tailored lines of a heavy, charcoal wool coat, would easily intercept any lateral movement I attempted toward the fire escape window. He was not carrying a visible weapon in his hands, but the slight, weighted drape of his jacket on the left side indicated a holstered firearm, perfectly positioned for a rapid cross-body draw. I swallowed hard, the sound deafening in my own ears. My mouth tasted entirely like the metallic copper of fear. Hours started with blood and thunder, and a woman stupid enough to think she could hide from the underworld by simply closing her blinds. The dim streetlight, filtering through the uncurtained window, finally caught the sharp, aristocratic angles of his face. I had never seen a photograph of him before tonight. The Ricchetti family did not leave careless digital footprints, but the brutal, cold intelligence radiating from his deep-set, ash-gray eyes was an unmistakable signature. He possessed the kind of face that belonged on ancient Roman coins, beautiful, symmetrical, and entirely unforgiving. There was a small, pale scar cutting through the dark line of his left eyebrow, a quiet testament to the fact that his absolute authority had not been inherited passively. It had been fought for in the dark. He stared at me. He did not speak. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy, pulling the remaining oxygen from the cramped, freezing space. I was an acoustic phonetician. I analyzed human communication for a living. I understood the mechanics of interrogation, the deliberate pacing of a physical threat, and the crushing psychological weight of a pause. The man looming in my doorway was employing a textbook dominance display, perfectly calibrated to let my own hyper-vigilant paranoia do all the heavy lifting. He was waiting for me to break, to babble, to offer an excuse or a frantic defense for whatever perceived crime had brought him to my door at midnight. But I was not a low-level associate caught stealing from the ledgers. I was a professional survivor. I locked my knees to stop them from visibly trembling. I forced my spine straight, refusing to cower, even as every instinct in my body screamed at me to drop to the floor and surrender. I dragged in a slow, shallow breath through my nose, attempting to steady the frantic rhythm of my lungs. The translation, I managed to say, my voice coming out as a thin, raspy whisper that sounded entirely foreign to my own ears. I paused and cleared my throat, forcing the vocal cords to engage properly, relying on years of technical muscle memory to stabilize my pitch. The translation was absolutely accurate. I double-checked the spectral baseline before I sent it through the proxy. The Eastern dialect markers on the wiretap were undeniable. I was expecting anger. I was fully expecting the cold, terrifying rage of a mob boss who had just discovered a rat in his ranks, or perhaps a ruthless employer who believed his freelance linguist had made a fatal error. Instead, the towering shadow simply tilted his head a fraction of an inch. "I know," he said. It was the first time I had ever heard his voice in person. My brain instantly isolated and dissected the acoustic properties of the sound. His tone was a deep, resonant baritone, vibrating entirely in the chest cavity, without a single trace of glottal tension. His pitch was perfectly level, exhibiting absolutely no stress markers, no elevated heart rate, and no emotional volatility. He sounded as calm as a man ordering a cup of coffee on a Sunday morning. That complete lack of physiological stress in a situation this volatile was utterly terrifying. It meant violence was not an unpredictable spike in his emotional baseline. It was his default operating state. He stepped forward, crossing the threshold completely, and pulled the heavy wooden door shut behind him. The sharp click of the latch engaging severed my final, desperate connection to the outside world. The freezing hallway was gone. Mr. Vance's muffled television across the landing was gone. There was only the suffocating intimacy of my tiny apartment and the most dangerous man in Boston occupying it. I had spent the last 300 days conditioning my nervous system to expect danger in the form of chaotic, senseless noise. My ex-husband, a pathetic man built on fragile ego and cheap liquor, announced his violence with shattered glass, screaming matches, and the heavy, unpredictable slamming of doors. He was a hurricane of toxic, undisciplined rage. I knew exactly how to navigate a hurricane. I knew how to read the barometric pressure of a room, how to make myself small, how to calculate the exact millisecond to bolt for the nearest exit before the storm made landfall. But Nicholas was not a hurricane. He was the cold, crushing pressure of the deep ocean. He did not require noise or frantic motion to establish his absolute dominance. The sheer, undeniable gravity of his presence simply demanded that the world yield around him. He moved further into the room, and the physical reality of my desperate poverty seemed to violently clash with his sheer existence. The apartment shrank. The low, water-damaged ceiling, stained with years of neglected leaks, suddenly felt entirely too close to my head. The cracked linoleum, sticky with cheap adhesive and decades of grime, seemed to buckle under the polished, expensive leather of his Oxfords. The immense wealth radiating from his bespoke clothing stood in grotesque opposition to the peeling yellow wallpaper and the dripping, rust-stained kitchen sink behind me. He brought the crisp, sharp scent of winter ozone and the deep, masculine, grounding aroma of cedarwood into a room that permanently smelled of damp plaster and cheap bleach. The sensory contrast was dizzying, effectively tearing away the fragile illusion of safety I had built for myself. He unbuttoned the center button of the thick outer garment with a slow, deliberate motion of his left hand. The movement was entirely smooth, a casual display of fine motor control that revealed the impeccable cut of the dark charcoal suit beneath it. His gaze, piercing and analytical, swept over the grim reality of my living conditions. He processed the environment with the exact same ruthless efficiency I used to process a corrupted audio file. I watched his eyes track with predatory precision. He looked at the deadbolt he had effortlessly bypassed, assessing the cheap brass cylinder and the flimsy screws holding the strike plate to the rotted door frame. He looked down at the scuffed, uneven floorboards, noting the distinct lack of a rug or any semblance of domestic warmth. Finally, his gaze drifted across the room to the makeshift workstation, set up on a wobbly folding table in the corner. My dual monitors still glowing brightly with the neon blue light of the spectrogram I had just deciphered. I felt a sudden, sharp spike of humiliation pierce through the heavy blanket of my terror. I possessed a master's degree in applied linguistics from a highly prestigious university. I had once owned a beautiful sunlit condominium in the Back Bay, decorated with modern art and thriving houseplants. I had worn tailored silk blouses and carried a heavy leather briefcase into the glass-walled conference rooms of corporate law firms. I had been highly respected. I had been an independent professional. Now I was standing in an oversized, pilling thrift store sweater, cornered in a freezing slum, entirely at the mercy of a syndicate kingpin, because my ex-husband had systematically destroyed my credit, my career, and my physical safety. I had been forced into the shadows just to survive, translating illicit wiretaps in the dead of night to pay the exorbitant medical debts and legal fees left in the wake of my disastrous marriage. The profound injustice of it burned in the back of my throat, a bitter acidic tang that briefly recklessly overrode my paralyzing fear. If you know the translation is accurate, I said, forcing my vocal cadence into a steady, flat rhythm. I kept my hands visible, resting them lightly against the edge of the chipped counter to anchor myself, desperate to hide the violent trembling in my fingers. Then why are you here, Mr. Ketty? My contract stipulates digital contact only. I deliver the acoustic analysis. You deliver the cryptocurrency payment to the proxy wallet. There is absolutely no operational protocol that requires a physical breach of my residence. Some stories didn't have neat endings. Some involved living daily in spaces between right and wrong, justice and compromise, love and complications. I had accepted the dark compromise of working for a criminal empire to secure my physical survival and to keep Elena safe, but I had never agreed to let the empire walk directly into my kitchen. The predator stopped roughly 6 feet away from me. He was close enough now that the ambient yellow light from the under-cabinet fixture illuminated the harsh, uncompromising lines of his jaw. I could see the faint shadow of exhaustion beneath his eyes, a mirroring of my own relentless, grinding night shift. But while my exhaustion made me fragile, stripping away my defenses until I was running on raw nerve endings, His exhaustion seemed to only temper him. It hardened his features into something forged from industrial steel. Protocol, he repeated softly. He tested the word on his tongue as if he found the concept mildly amusing. An archaic, useless rule that simply did not apply to men of his stature. He did not smile, but a dark, imperceptible shift occurred in the rigid set of his jaw. The subtle tension in his masseter muscle indicated a high degree of suppressed, lethal calculation. He looked down at me. I was 5'4" on a good day. Without my shoes, standing in just my thin cotton socks on the freezing linoleum, the height disparity between us was physically overwhelming. Yet, he did not loom over me aggressively. He did not step into my immediate personal space to intimidate me with his mass. He simply stood his ground, an immovable monolith of violence, radiating a quiet, suffocating authority that demanded total submission without a single raised decibel. His eyes dropped from my face, traveling in a slow, highly observant sweep down the length of my body. It was not an appraisal of desire. It was a clinical, tactical assessment of a severely compromised asset. He noted the way my fingers gripped the edge of the countertop until my knuckles turned the color of old parchment. He cataloged the slight, involuntary tremor locking my knees, and the shallow, rapid rise and fall of my chest beneath the thick wool of my sweater. He was reading my somatic responses. He was watching me endure a full-blown hypervigilant panic attack, and he was memorizing every single flinch, every single micro-expression of terror. "You're shivering," he stated. It wasn't a question. It was a clinical observation, delivered with the absolute certainty of a man who missed nothing in his environment. "The building's boiler is broken," I replied immediately, my tone strictly defensive, the words tumbling out of my mouth before I could properly filter them. I did not want his pity. I did not want his intense, predatory attention focused on my physical vulnerabilities. "It has been broken for 3 days. The landlord refuses to send maintenance. I am entirely fine." "You are not fine, Maya," he countered. His voice dropped a fraction of an octave, the baritone resonance vibrating heavily against the fragile, frozen silence of the room. Hearing him say my first name, a name that was absolutely not on the fake lease, a name I had buried under thick, expensive layers of encrypted aliases and shell identities, sent a fresh, electric jolt of adrenaline straight into my heart. My breath hitched, catching painfully in my dry throat. He knew who I was. He knew exactly who I was. The discrepancy in my background check was likely small. Perhaps a mere 3% variance in a social security history column, or a minor routing anomaly in my proxy server setup. But to Nicholas Archetti, it had screamed like a siren in a silent room. He had not just blindly employed a ghost. He had systematically dismantled the ghost. He knew about my past. He knew about the medical debts I was paying to keep my sister in school. He knew about the abusive man I was terrified of. He had known the entire time. "How did you find this exact address?" I demanded, the last remnants of my professional linguistic detachment fracturing into a million sharp, useless pieces. My voice shook violently, betraying the raw, unadulterated terror I was desperately trying to conceal behind a mask of competence. The VPN array I use bounces through 6 international servers. My IP address is mathematically masked by military-grade encryption. I have absolutely no digital footprint in this city. It is impossible for you to track the origin of the audio drops. The syndicate head remained perfectly still. He did not boast about his endless resources. He did not explain the vast, terrifying network of corrupted telecommunication executives he owned, or the army of digital forensic trackers he employed to monitor his highly sensitive assets. He simply watched me, his steel-colored gaze fixing on mine, with an intensity that felt like physical pressure against my chest. Then, with a terrifyingly slow, deliberate motion, he reached into the inside breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket. My entire body flinched backward. It was a violent, involuntary somatic response, trained into my deepest muscle memory, by a man who used to reach into his pockets for brass knuckles, or a heavy set of keys. My shoulder blade slammed hard against the wooden edge of the kitchen cabinet behind me. The sudden impact sent a dull, throbbing ache radiating down my spine. I squeezed my eyes tightly shut, bracing for the gleam of a weapon, bracing for the inevitable, brutal violence that had finally, inevitably caught up with me in the dark. "I'm not negotiating the terms of my surrender," I thought wildly, my fingernails digging into my own palms until the skin nearly broke. "I'm clarifying the job description. I was supposed to be invisible. I was supposed to be safe. But the strike never came. The gunshot did not sound. The physical blow did not land. The room remained completely, oppressively silent, save for the rhythmic, maddening drip of the leaky faucet and the harsh, ragged sound of my own terrified breathing echoing in the small space. "Open your eyes, Maya," he commanded softly. The gentle, unwavering authority in his quiet tone was far more devastating than a shout could ever be. It completely bypassed my defensive shields, wrapping around my hyperventilating panic like a heavy, suffocating blanket. I forced my eyelids open, my chest heaving erratically, fully expecting to stare down the dark, hollow barrel of a suppressed pistol. Instead, Nicholas was holding a sleek, black smartphone. His large, leather-gloved thumb rested casually on the side of the device, perfectly still, waiting for my panicked gaze to drop to the glowing screen, illuminating the dark space between us. I stared at the glowing rectangular screen, the harsh blue-white light illuminating the leather of his glove, and casting long, ominous shadows against the peeling wallpaper of my kitchen. My brain, already running on the frantic, jagged energy of a severe adrenaline spike, struggled to process the visual information being presented to me. I had expected a weapon. I had expected a digital ledger detailing my linguistic analysis, or a wiretap transcript that I had somehow misinterpreted. I had not expected to see my own face staring back at me. It was the photograph, the exact, identical image I had captured barely 10 minutes ago, while standing directly in front of this very sink. On the high-definition OLED display of his device, the picture appeared even more stark, more desperately manufactured. There I was, wrapped in the oversized thrift store cream sweater, bathed in the false golden glow of the under-cabinet light. The dark, bruised exhaustion under my eyes was poorly concealed by the forced, fragile curve of my mouth. It was a private transmission, a temporary digital bridge constructed solely to alleviate my younger sister Elena's crippling anxiety about my late-night shifts. The cognitive dissonance of seeing that deeply personal, vulnerable moment held in the leather-clad hand of a mafia kingpin was paralyzing. My analytical mind immediately went to war with my panic, desperately trying to calculate the mathematical probability of this breach. I had spent hours optimizing my digital hygiene. My laptop was stripped of its internal microphone and camera. I routed my traffic through 3 separate VPN layers, bouncing IPs from Switzerland to Iceland before they ever hit the eastern seaboard. The messaging application I used to communicate with Elena was built on end-to-end AES 256 encryption. It was an open-source protocol specifically designed by privacy advocates to be impervious to standard interception techniques. The cryptographic keys were stored locally on our respective hardware. It was theoretically impossible for a third party to intercept the transmission in transit. Yet, Nicholas Ricchetti was holding the decrypted image, the timestamp on the upper corner of his screen, confirming he had acquired it mere seconds after I had hit send. He hadn't just bypassed the physical deadbolt on my apartment door. He had systematically dismantled the digital fortress I had spent the last 8 months building. He possessed a level of surveillance infrastructure that rivaled federal intelligence agencies. He was monitoring my encrypted traffic in real time. The profound, terrifying realization that I had never truly been hidden. Every message, every keystroke, every desperate attempt to maintain a connection with my sister had been observed by the syndicate. Hit me like a physical blow to the sternum. "Who took this picture, Maya?" he asked. The question was delivered in that same smooth, devastatingly calm baritone. He did not raise his voice. He did not step closer to use his overwhelming physical mass as leverage. He simply stood there, a towering monolith of dark charcoal wool and bespoke tailoring, turning a seemingly innocuous question into a lethal interrogation. I blinked, the dry, burning sensation in my eyes momentarily blurring the image on his screen. The absurdity of the situation briefly short-circuited my hypervigilant terror. The deadliest predator on the eastern seaboard, a predator who orchestrated multi-million-dollar logistics empires and ordered the silent erasure of his enemies, had breached a freezing, dilapidated slum at midnight to demand the origin of a selfie. I don't understand, I stammered, the words catching on the dry, terrified texture of my throat. I tore my gaze away from the glowing phone and stared up at his face. The sharp, aristocratic angles of his jaw were set in stone. The ash gray of his eyes was entirely unreadable, reflecting no emotion. No anger, only a cold, calculating intensity that pinned me in place like an insect under a microscope. He wasn't acting like a spurned lover or a toxic, controlling partner demanding to know who I was with. That was the domain of weak, insecure men like my ex-husband. Men who used volume and violence to compensate for their lack of actual power. Nicholas Ricchetti did not care about my personal life in any romantic capacity. He was an apex predator conducting a threat assessment. To him, an unknown variable in the immediate vicinity of a highly classified syndicate asset. Me was a vulnerability, and Nicholas did not tolerate vulnerabilities. "Who took the picture?" he repeated, his tone dropping half an octave, the acoustic resonance vibrating heavily against the cold air of the kitchen. "Answer the question. Accurately." He was waiting for a name. He was waiting for me to confess that I had violated the cardinal rule of our arrangement by allowing a third party into my workspace. He believed that someone else was standing in this freezing kitchen with me, potentially compromising the highly classified wiretap files I was translating on the dual monitors just a few feet away. I swallowed hard, tasting the distinct metallic copper of blood where I had unconsciously bitten the inside of my cheek. My vocal cords felt tight, constricted by the sheer crushing pressure of his presence. "No one," I said, my voice barely more than a raspy whisper. I forced myself to take a shallow breath, relying on years of linguistic training to steady my cadence. "I am entirely alone, Mr. Ricchetti. I have been alone since I moved into this unit." His eyes narrowed infinitesimally. It was a micro-expression so subtle that anyone not trained in reading human communication would have missed it completely. But to me, it was the equivalent of a warning siren. It was the physical manifestation of his absolute disbelief. "Do not lie to me," he commanded softly. The leather of his glove creaked as his thumb shifted slightly on the bezel of the phone. The gesture was small, but it carried the weight of an executioner adjusting his grip. "I do not ask questions when I do not already possess the answers. I am giving you the opportunity to explain the variable in this room, before I tear this building apart to find them myself." The threat was not an exaggeration. I could practically feel the kinetic energy coiled within his massive frame, ready to explode outward into systematic, devastating violence. He carried the scent of winter ozone, cedar wood, and the faint, unmistakable copper of fresh blood, a sensory cocktail that communicated exactly what he was capable of doing to anyone he deemed a threat. I pressed my lower back harder against the edge of the chipped counter, my fingers curling tightly around the worn formica to keep my hands from visibly shaking. I was not lying, and the fact that a man with his level of resources and intelligence could not deduce the obvious physics of a front-facing camera was incredibly disorienting. "I took it myself," I insisted, forcing a layer of professional firmness into my tone, refusing to let him intimidate me into a false confession. "It is a digital photograph taken with the front-facing lens of my own mobile device." I extended my right arm, angled the lens downward to exclude the water damage on the ceiling, and triggered the shutter. That is why my right shoulder appears slightly elevated in the frame. It is a standard biomechanical posture for a self-portrait. I was falling back on my clinical, analytical nature, attempting to use logic and structural evidence to dismantle his accusation. If I could explain the geometry of the shot, I could prove my isolation. I could prove that I was still the perfect invisible ghost he paid me to be. "I took the photograph exactly 12 minutes ago." I continued, my analytical engine firing rapidly, cataloging the sequence of events. "I took it while standing in this exact position, in front of this sink. There is no one else here. There has never been anyone else here. I do not have guests. I do not have visitors. I do not even speak to Mr. Vance, my elderly neighbor across the hall. I have adhered strictly to the security protocols you outlined in my initial contract." Nicholas stared at me, his slate eyes instantly cataloging the rapid, desperate movement of my mouth. He was reading my somatic responses again, evaluating the dilation of my pupils, the steady, defensive lock of my knees, and the absolute conviction in my voice. He was searching for the micro-tremors of deception, the slight hesitation that always accompanied a lie. He found nothing because there was nothing to find. There was no phantom lover hiding in my bathroom. There was no corporate spy lurking in the narrow hallway outside my door. There was only me, the dripping faucet, and the crushing weight of a mafia kingpin invading my last safe space. "I am telling you the truth," I whispered, the remaining adrenaline bleeding out of my system, leaving me hollow, exhausted, and desperately cold. "Why would you intercept my private transmission just to accuse me of something so easily disprovable?" The silence that followed was heavier than anything I had experienced in my life. It wasn't the chaotic, breathless silence that precedes domestic violence. It was the vast, calculating silence of a master tactician, recalculating an entire battlefield based on a single new piece of intelligence. Nicholas slowly lowered the smartphone, the harsh blue-white light tracking down the front of his dark charcoal suit until it illuminated the polished leather of his shoes, resting on my cracked linoleum floor. He tilted his head again, a slow, predatory movement that sent a fresh chill racing down my spine. The dim ambient light from the street lamp outside caught the pale scar cutting through his left eyebrow, highlighting the absolute, terrifying stillness of his features. "If you took the picture yourself, Maya," he said, his voice dropping to a near-silent register that somehow commanded more authority than a deafening roar, "then why are you staring into the lens? When the threat is standing directly behind you." I stopped breathing. The biological mechanism simply ceased functioning. My lungs locked up, paralyzed by a sudden, glacial spike of pure terror that bypassed my analytical brain and struck directly at my primal survival instincts. The words hung in the freezing air of the kitchen, heavy and toxic, slowly dismantling my entire perception of reality. "The threat is standing directly behind you. My ex-husband." That was the immediate, violent conclusion my traumatized nervous system generated. My brain flashed with a rapid, terrifying montage of shattered glass, bruised wrists, and the heavy, slurred shouting that used to echo through my old condominium. He had found me. The corrupt police contacts he cultivated had finally cracked my digital aliases. He was here, in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to break down my final door. But that didn't make logical sense. If my ex-husband had breached the apartment, Nicholas Arquetti would not be standing here calmly holding a smartphone. The syndicate boss would have neutralized the intrusion with the same ruthless efficiency he applied to his corporate enemies. There would be blood on the cracked linoleum, not a quiet interrogation. I shook my head, a small, frantic motion, my defensive shields completely collapsing under the weight of his statement. "What are you talking about?" I demanded, my voice cracking, the professional linguistic control I had maintained entirely evaporating. "There is no one behind me. The only thing behind me is the window. The alleyway is empty. I am on the 4th floor. It is physically impossible for someone to be behind me, unless they are standing on the fire escape." I turned my head instinctively, my heart hammering a frantic, bird-like rhythm against my ribs. I stared over my shoulder, analyzing the dark, uncurtained glass of the window situated directly above the rusted kitchen sink. Because the small, golden under-cabinet light was currently off, and the room was bathed only in the dim illumination filtering in. From the street, the glass was completely transparent. I could see the rusted iron slats of the fire escape, coated in a thin layer of winter frost. I could see the dark, narrow chasm of the alleyway plunging down into the shadows between the brick buildings. It was entirely empty. The fire escape, a rusted monstrosity that violated half a dozen municipal building codes, was completely barren. The thin crust of ice coating the iron steps was undisturbed. The brick wall of the adjacent tenement building stood silent and unyielding. There was nothing out there but the biting Boston wind and the falling snow. The physical evidence before my eyes directly contradicted the absolute certainty radiating from his stance. I spun back around to face the towering monolith occupying my entryway. "There is nothing there," I insisted, my tone climbing in pitch, a desperate, panicked edge bleeding into the syllables. "I am alone." Nicholas did not react to my rising panic. His massive frame remained perfectly still, an immovable anchor in the center of my spiraling reality. He slowly raised his left hand, the fine motor control of the movement contrasting sharply with the sheer lethal power coiled in his shoulders. He extended his index finger and tapped the glowing screen of his smartphone twice in rapid succession. He had zoomed in. He stepped forward, closing the distance between us with a terrifying, silent grace that completely defied his size. The oppressive, intoxicating scent of cedar, leather, and winter ozone washed over me, drowning out the damp, mildewed smell of the apartment. He stopped just 2 feet away from me. I had to tilt my head sharply upward to maintain eye contact, the physical disparity between us making me feel incredibly small, incredibly fragile. He held the device out, positioning the screen directly in my line of sight. "Examine the glass, Maya," he commanded, his baritone completely devoid of impatience, offering only a cold, clinical directive. Not the subject, the reflection. I forced my burning, exhausted eyes to focus on the digital image. He had cropped the photograph, entirely removing my forced, tired smile and the oversized cream sweater from the frame. The image was now hyper-focused on the upper right quadrant of the picture. The dark, uncurtained window that I had purposefully used as a black backdrop to hide my poverty from my sister. Because the under-cabinet light had been on when I took the selfie, the glass had acted as a perfect mirror, reflecting the ambient darkness of the alleyway behind me. But the high-resolution lens of my smartphone had captured more than just the darkness. It had captured a shadow within the shadow. My breath hitched painfully in my throat, a sharp, ragged sound that echoed loudly in the quiet kitchen. There, standing on the rusted iron slats of the fire escape directly across from my apartment window, was a silhouette. It was perfectly camouflaged against the dark brick of the opposing building, blending seamlessly into the night. It was a masterclass in urban camouflage. If the ambient light from the street lamp hadn't caught the distinct, matte black finish of a weapon, I would have dismissed the anomaly as a smudge on the glass, or a trick of the falling snow. But the outline was undeniable. The faint glow from 3 stories below illuminated the edge of a heavy winter coat, the broad, rigid line of a man's shoulder, and the distinct, unmistakable shape of a suppressed firearm held casually at his side. It was not my ex-husband. My ex-husband was a coward who relied on intimidation and sudden, explosive rage. He was a petty, insecure tyrant who hid behind a veneer of middle-class respectability, totally lacking the capital to contract organized violence. The figure in the reflection was entirely different. He possessed a terrifying, absolute stillness. He was a professional, a predator patiently waiting in the freezing cold, watching me through the glass while I remained completely, foolishly oblivious to his existence. My acoustic analysis skills, the very talent that made me valuable, were entirely useless against a threat that made no sound. I had been sitting in my living room for 6 hours, wearing heavy foam headphones, meticulously dismantling the phonetic structures of a hit list, completely unaware that I was actively being hunted. The sheer horror of the realization crashed over me like a tidal wave of ice water. My knees finally buckled. The structural integrity of my defensive postures simply gave out under the crushing weight of the visual evidence. I stumbled backward, my hip colliding painfully against the sharp edge of the counter. I would have collapsed entirely onto the cracked linoleum if Nicholas had not moved. His left hand shot out with blinding speed, the leather of his glove gripping my upper arm just below the shoulder. His hold was incredibly firm, possessing the unyielding strength of industrial steel, but it was not punishing. It was an absolute, physical anchor preventing me from falling into the abyss. The heat radiating from his massive frame seeped through the thick wool of my sweater, a shocking contrast to the freezing temperature of the room and the ice running through my veins. "You are shaking?" he observed quietly, his voice a low, steady rumble that seemed to vibrate directly through the points of contact between us. "He has a gun," I whispered, my voice completely shattered, the words vibrating with a primal animalistic terror. "He has a gun and he was watching me. He was standing right there." My eyes darted frantically toward the actual window behind me, expecting the glass to suddenly shatter inward, expecting the fatal impact of a high-velocity round to tear through the damp plaster walls. The somatic hypervigilance I had carefully managed for months mutated into full-blown panic. I couldn't drag enough oxygen into my lungs. The kitchen began to spin, the peeling yellow wallpaper blurring at the edges of my vision. "Do not stare at the window," Nicholas ordered, his grip on my arm tightening just a fraction, pulling my attention back to him by sheer physical force. "Focus on me." I snapped my gaze back to his face. His stormy irises locked onto mine with an intensity that burned through the gloom of the stairwell. He was not a man who yielded to fear. He was a man who weaponized it. "I have been completely off the grid for 8 months," I babbled, the clinical detachment of my profession completely failing me. My fingers dug desperately into the fabric of his dark charcoal suit, an involuntary action seeking the only source of solid stability in the room. I followed every protocol. I masked the IP drops. I paid the rent in cash. How did he find me? Is he one of my ex-husband's people? Did that coward somehow find the money to put a hit out on me? "No," Nicholas replied, his tone remaining perfectly flat, entirely devoid of the chaos that was currently ripping my world apart. "The man in the alley is not a domestic abuser's hired thug. His name is Dante Drago. He is a syndicate operative contracted by the Eastern Crew, the same crew you just translated on the wiretap." The information processed slowly through my panic-addled brain. "Dante Drago, a syndicate hitman. They didn't find you through a digital trace, Maya," Nicholas continued, his voice steady, grounding me with logic when my emotions were failing. They found you because a low-level courier in my logistics chain made a critical error and was interrogated. They know I employ a forensic phonetician to dismantle their encrypted communications. They do not know your name. They do not know your history. But they found your physical location. He released his grip on my upper arm, only to slide his leather-clad hand smoothly down the length of my sleeve until his long fingers wrapped entirely around my trembling wrist. He did not ask for permission. He did not hesitate. In my world, when I claim something as mine, I protect it absolutely. The unspoken rule of the underworld was suddenly materializing right in front of me. He wasn't holding me hostage. He was establishing a physical perimeter of absolute protection. Drago was not sent here to kill you immediately, Nicholas stated, his eyes locking onto mine, forcing me to absorb the terrifying reality of the situation. You are the mechanism that gives my family an unparalleled intelligence advantage. Killing you is a temporary victory. Drago was sent here to monitor you, to find a vulnerability, to abduct you and turn your linguistic talents against me. A sickening wave of nausea rolled through my stomach. To be hunted by a violent ex-husband was a nightmare I had spent a year running from. To be hunted by a highly organized, heavily armed syndicate crew seeking to exploit my intellect was an entirely different level of hell. I was completely defenseless. I had no weapons, no security detail, no panic room. I was just a tired woman in an oversized sweater, who had accidentally photographed her own stalker. "We need to call the police," I said automatically, the ingrained, desperate response of a civilian echoing through the room. "We have the photograph. We have proof of an armed man on the fire escape." The moment the words left my mouth, I realized how incredibly stupid they sounded. I was standing in a freezing kitchen, holding on to the tailored lapels of the Eastern Seaboard's most lethal figure, suggesting we dial 911 to report a syndicate hitman. The irony was so sharp it almost physically hurt. Nicholas did not laugh. He did not mock my naivety. The cold, brutal intelligence in his eyes simply hardened, transforming from calculating observation into absolute, uncompromising authority. "The police cannot protect you from Dante Drago," he said quietly, his baritone completely filling the cramped space, leaving no room for argument or negotiation. "The police operate on bureaucracy, paperwork, and delayed response times. Drago operates on hollow point ammunition and a complete disregard for the law. If you involve law enforcement, you will simply become a high-profile target, sitting in a vulnerable precinct holding cell." He stepped even closer, the sheer physical mass of his body completely eclipsing the dim light of the kitchen. "You are a highly valuable asset to my organization, Maya," he continued, his tone echoing with a deep, dangerous finality that sent a shiver racing across my collarbone. "Your acoustic analysis has saved my family millions of dollars and prevented a dozen ambushes. I do not allow my assets to be compromised. I do not allow my employees to be hunted." He reached up with his free hand, his leather glove gently brushing against the collar of my pilling sweater. The touch was incredibly light, a stark, jarring contrast to the violent reality of our conversation, but it carried the undeniable weight of absolute ownership. "Your invisibility is gone," he stated, pronouncing the death sentence on the quiet, solitary life I had fought so hard to build. "This apartment is compromised. Your aliases are burned. The shadows will no longer hide you." I stared up at him, my breathing rapid and shallow. The illusion of safety I had meticulously constructed over the last 8 months was completely incinerated, reduced to ash by a single innocent selfie and the cold reality of the underworld. I had nothing left, no sanctuary, no backup plan. "Then what do?" I whispered, the desperate, hollow sound of a woman who had finally run out of places to hide. Nicholas Ricchetti looked down at me, his storm-colored eyes reflecting the dark, terrifying promise of a man who solved problems by erasing them from existence. "You leave," he commanded softly. He didn't ask. He didn't offer a polite suggestion. It was a tactical directive issued by a kingpin, who was already moving his empire to protect his investment. He released my wrist, stepping back slightly, though the overwhelming pressure of his presence remained absolute. The black wool coat, draped over his broad shoulders, shifted as he reached up and unbuttoned it entirely. It was a stunning piece of bespoke tailoring, a heavy cashmere blend woven to withstand the brutal northeastern winters. With a smooth, practiced motion, he shrugged the heavy, expensive garment off. He took a step forward, completely invading my personal space, and draped the massive coat over my shivering shoulders. The physical impact of the garment was immediate. The thick cashmere blend was incredibly heavy, practically suffocating in its warmth. It carried his distinct sensory signature, the deep grounding scent of cedar, leather, and winter frost. It wrapped around my small frame like a tailored fortress, instantly cutting through the bitter cold of the drafty apartment, and the icy terror freezing my blood. The silk lining slid smoothly against my neck, a luxurious tactile reminder of the vast, untouchable power the man standing in front of me wielded. I stood frozen, completely enveloped in his scent and his heat, unable to process the abrupt transition from lethal interrogation to somatic rescue. "Gather your encrypted ledgers and your translation hardware," Nicholas ordered, his tone shifting back to the cold clinical efficiency of a commander directing a battlefield evacuation. "Leave the rest. It is garbage. You have exactly 3 minutes before my extraction team breaches the perimeter of this building to neutralize Drago." I blinked, the sleeves of his coat hanging past my fingertips, my mind struggling to keep up with the violent acceleration of events. "Where am I going?" I asked, the panic returning as I realized he was actively severing me from the only home I had. Nicholas turned his back on the dark, compromised window, positioning himself firmly between me and the invisible threat in the alleyway. "You are no longer a ghost, Maya," he said, his voice echoing with a low, dangerous finality that left no room for argument. "You are coming with me." The words hung in the freezing air of the cramped kitchen, not as a desperate proposal or a chaotic demand, but as a fundamental law of gravity. I stood motionless for exactly 3 seconds, my racing mind struggling to process the sheer, overwhelming momentum of his directive. I was wrapped inside the voluminous cashmere overcoat, a cedar and leather scented fortress, the luxurious silk lining, sliding smoothly against the sensitive, shivering skin of my neck. The residual heat of Nicholas Urquetti's massive frame still clung to the fabric, a profound, startling contrast to the icy draft leaking through the compromised window frame. The scent was intoxicating, a deeply masculine blend of sharp winter air, rich cedar, and well-worn leather that somehow quieted the frantic buzzing in my skull. I did not argue. I did not weep, and I certainly did not collapse into a puddle of passive, hysterical victimhood. In my world, a world dictated by the ruthless metrics of survival and evasion, hesitation was the absolute easiest way to get yourself killed. Should the hitman, Dante Drago, currently be perched on the rusted iron slats of the fire escape across the dark alleyway with a suppressed, high-velocity rifle, every single millisecond I spent processing my emotional trauma was a millisecond closer to a hollow point round, shattering the glass behind us. My cracked smartphone, the exact device that had just captured Dante's lethal silhouette lurking on the fire escape in a photo meant to reassure my sister Elena, was powered down and buried deep in my front pocket. A single, innocent selfie. That was all it took. One fleeting moment of wanting to show my sheltered sister I was safe and secure in my apartment, and I had inadvertently exposed my ultraviolence. I had failed to see the threat in the window's reflection. But the digital upload had also brought the absolute ruler of the Boston underworld directly to my doorstep, bypassing every pathetic deadbolt I had, to stand as a literal human shield between me and the stalker outside. I forced my locked knees to bend. I turned my back on the towering, impenetrable monolith of the mafia boss, and moved rapidly toward my makeshift translation workstation in the corner of the room. The cracked, peeling linoleum groaned faintly beneath my thin cotton socks. I had exactly 3 minutes before his extraction team breaches the perimeter of this rotting tenement building. 3 minutes to compress an entire, meticulously constructed shadow existence into a single waterproof go bag. I ignored the cheap pilling thrift store clothing hanging in the flimsy plastic closet of my bedroom. Nicholas had explicitly categorized the rest of my belongings as garbage, and from a purely logical standpoint, his clinical assessment was correct. Faded denim and cheap wool could be easily replaced. My physical safety was paramount, but my digital integrity, the coded wiretap ledger and the highly classified linguistic infrastructure resting on the wobbly folding table, was the only currency I possessed that made me valuable enough to warrant the direct, personal protection of the Eastern Seaboard's most dangerous man. I reached behind the primary glowing monitor, my cold, trembling fingers instinctively navigating the tangled web of heavy, braided cables connecting my encrypted storage arrays. I didn't just systematically unplug them from the motherboard. I engaged the physical fail-safe kill switches. Forensic linguistics, especially the illegal interception and acoustic decoding of syndicate wiretaps, required massive amounts of processing power and highly secured localized storage. I had 3 external solid-state drives daisy-chained to a primary processing core. The first external unit held the raw, highly sensitive audio intercepts. The second drive contained my proprietary spectral analysis software and complex phase vocoding algorithms. The third volatile memory bank was linked directly to the proxy servers I used to anonymously drop the finished intelligence files to the Ricchetti family. In the event that Dante Drago managed to breach this room and seize those units, the resulting intelligence leak wouldn't just compromise Nicholas. It would trigger a bloodbath across the entire eastern seaboard. I unspooled the encrypted, titanium USB key from the thin silver chain around my neck. The physical biometric authenticator I never took off, not even in the shower, and jammed it violently into the primary terminal port. I typed a 32-character alphanumeric sequence with flawless, rapid muscle memory, my knuckles white with tension. The dual monitors flashed a stark, blinding, blood-red warning screen. Wipe protocol initiated. 22M standard. Not a simple file deletion. A standard deletion merely removed the directory pathways, leaving the raw data fully intact for any competent digital forensic investigator to recover. This was a synchronized, multi-pass overwrite. I watched the progress bar surge as the protocol flooded the solid-state memory sectors with endless, randomized streams of binary noise, zeros and ones overlapping and incinerating the digital architecture of my life, effectively reducing highly classified syndicate secrets to absolute, unrecoverable digital ash. I could feel the immense suffocating weight of Nicholas's attention pressing against my spine. The mafia kingpin had not moved to rush my actions. He was standing perfectly still near the center of the kitchen, his broad shoulders and unyielding mass acting as a deliberate, human shield between my vulnerable workstation and the exposed sightline of the dark window. He was watching my hands. He was meticulously assessing my efficiency under the crushing pressure of an imminent lethal threat. A lesser man, a weaker commander, might have expected frantic fumbling, hyperventilation, or perhaps the hysterical, irrational gathering of sentimental trinkets. Instead, he was quietly witnessing a highly trained intelligence asset, systematically sanitizing a compromised operational environment with cold, clinical detachment. The localized data wipe will take exactly 45 seconds to complete the final overwrite pass, I stated, my voice remarkably steady, though it still carried a faint, raspy edge from the residual adrenaline burning through my veins. The primary processing core began to emit a sharp, high-pitched whine as the massive thermal load spiked. The faint, acrid scent of ozone and overheating silicon started to bleed into the freezing air of the kitchen, a stark olfactory marker of the digital cremation. But the software scrub is not a sufficient guarantee against a syndicate-level recovery effort. I need to physically destroy the logic board of the secondary backup unit. It cannot under any circumstances be left structurally intact. Do it, the mafia boss commanded softly. His baritone was a low, resonant hum that vibrated directly through the damp floorboards and up through the soles of feet. It was an absolute authorization, devoid of any doubt or micromanagement. I opened the top drawer of the wobbly folding table, shoving aside a pile of cheap pens and encrypted paper ledgers, and retrieved a heavy solid steel claw hammer I kept for emergency home repairs. I placed the black plastic casing of the secondary backup unit flat on the edge of the table, gripping the rubberized handle of the tool tightly to counteract the violent tremor in my wrists. I raised the heavy steel head high and brought it down violently, transferring every ounce of my terror, exhaustion, and simmering rage into the strike. Crack, the sharp, explosive sound of shattering reinforced plastic and snapping green fiberglass circuit boards echoed like a deafening gunshot in the cramped, freezing apartment. I did not stop. I raised the hammer and hit it a second time, and then a third, bringing the steel down with a rhythmic, devastating force. The high-pitched whine of the drives abruptly died, replaced by the crunch of destroying metal until the sensitive memory chips were reduced to useless silica dust, copper shards, and twisted, jagged edges. My breathing was ragged, my shoulders aching with the sudden sharp physical exertion. But the clinical, violent destruction of the hardware grounded my spiraling panic. I dropped the hammer onto the table with a heavy thud. I swept the intact, heavily encrypted master units into my padded, waterproof canvas messenger bag, aggressively shoving my specialized, professional-grade noise-canceling headphones in right beside them. While I secured the hardware, Nicholas initiated a rapid and highly methodical sweep of my pathetic living space. He moved with a lethal, terrifying grace that completely defied his massive size and the restriction of his tailored suit. He did not make a single, solitary sound. The polished Italian leather of his bespoke Oxfords glided over the uneven, creaking floorboards without disturbing the silence. He checked the blind corners of the tiny, water-damaged bathroom and the dark alcove of the bedroom, his pale eyes focusing on my profile with a cold, analytical intensity that mapped the compromised structural points of the thin plaster walls. He was calculating the ballistic trajectories of the building, calculating exactly where the hitman's line of sight ended and where our narrow corridor of safe passage began. The sheer overwhelming competence of his movements was deeply intoxicating. I had spent an entire year relying exclusively on myself, living in a permanent, exhausting state of somatic hypervigilance, constantly anticipating the next blow from the shadows. The night my ex-husband had shattered my sense of security, he had done it with broken glass, slurred screaming, and chaotic, unpredictable violence. Nicholas Ricchetti shattered my reality with absolute, terrifying silence and unparalleled precision. Now the most dangerous, untethered predator in the city was methodically clearing my blind spots, acting as a flawless, impenetrable vanguard. "Time," Nicholas said quietly, his gaze snapping back to my position by the desk. The single sharp syllable sliced effortlessly through the ambient hum of my dying computer monitors. "Done," I replied, zipping the heavy canvas messenger bag shut and slinging the thick nylon strap diagonally across my chest. The bag settled awkwardly against the thick cashmere lapels of his oversized coat. I felt ridiculous. A small, exhausted, disheveled woman drowning in an impossibly expensive tailored garment, clutching a canvas bag of shattered electronics in a freezing, rotting slum. I looked up into his face. A profound physical release grounded me instantly. Relief. Deep, profound, and utterly terrifying relief. It was the realization that the solitary war I had been fighting against the world was suddenly, violently over. I was no longer the sole architect of my own survival. Nicholas closed the remaining distance between us in 2 long, purposeful strides. He did not ask to carry my heavy bag. He did not attempt to diminish my autonomy or treat me like a fragile, broken piece of glass that needed to be coddled. He treated me like a highly valued, competent asset capable of managing my own vital logistics under live fire. But as we moved rapidly toward the breached, splintered frame of the front door, his large, leather-clad hand came to rest lightly, yet firmly, against the small of my back. The physical touch was strictly professional, a calculated physical maneuver designed to guide my forward momentum and ensure my smaller frame remained securely shielded behind his massive breadth. But the heavy, anchoring weight of his leather-clad palm bleeding through the thick layers of wool sent a sharp, involuntary shiver racing down my spine. Not a gentle, romantic caress, an unbreakable, absolute security tether. It was the first time in over 14 months that a man had touched me without the explicit intent to cause physical pain, inflict humiliation, or assert a toxic, suffocating dominance. His hand was an immovable anchor in a world that was rapidly spinning out control. "Stay securely on my right side," Nicholas murmured, his warm breath brushing the crown of my dark hair, as he reached out with his left hand to pull the ruined wooden door fully open. "Remain with your back, firmly pressed to the plaster of the hallway wall. Do not stop moving unless I specifically instruct you to halt. Do you understand?" "I understand," I whispered, my vocal cords tight but my mind locked into his frequency. We stepped out of the freezing apartment and into the dimly lit, claustrophobic corridor of the 4th floor. The ambient air out here was somehow even colder. I could feel the biting draft instantly nipping at my exposed face and the sensitive skin of my throat, sending a sharp sting over my flushed cheeks, even as Nicholas's heavy cashmere coat kept my torso enveloped in a thick, luxurious layer of trapped heat. The hallway smelled heavily of stale cigarette smoke, damp, rotting carpet, and the unmistakable, lingering despair of a building long abandoned by its absentee landlord. The flickering, dying fluorescent bulb overhead cast long, sickly yellow shadows against the peeling, water-stained paint of the walls. For 8 months, this hallway had been a gauntlet of terror for me. Every single night, coming home from a grueling double shift, at the cafe or a late-night translation drop, I had walked this narrow stretch with my apartment keys laced defensively through my knuckles, jumping at every creaking floorboard, absolutely terrified that my ex-husband was waiting in the gloom. Tonight, walking exactly half a step behind the mafia kingpin, the hallway felt fundamentally different. The oppressive space seemed to physically warp and yield around his immense gravity. He stepped out smoothly, his broad shoulders completely blocking the open doorway of my apartment. He didn't even bother reaching back to pull the door shut behind us. My life in that desperate, freezing room was permanently over. The physical shell of the apartment, the cracked linoleum, the dripping faucet, it was all irrelevant now. Then, the unmistakable, harsh metallic scrape of a deadbolt, turning echoed loudly through the silent, tense corridor. My heart instantly leaped into my throat, a fresh spike of adrenaline flooding my system. The sound originated from directly across the narrow landing. Door 4B, Mr. Vance. The heavy wooden door creaked open a few cautious inches, held securely in place by a thick brass chain lock. A thin sliver of warm, orange incandescent light spilled out into the grim, shadowed corridor, illuminating the wrinkled, deeply suspicious face of my elderly neighbor. The old man was a creature of rigid, unchanging habit, a perpetually irritated civilian, who documented every strange noise, every unfamiliar voice, and every late-night footstep with the obsessive, paranoid dedication of a neighborhood watchman who had long outlived his actual neighborhood. He gripped the edge of his peeling door with a pale, liver-spotted hand, his faded, watery blue eyes squinting aggressively against the harsh overhead fluorescent glare. "What's all that damn smashing?" Mr. Vance rasped loudly, his voice a dry, gravelly croak that broke the fragile silence of the hallway. He peered aggressively through the narrow gap, trying to locate the specific source of the violent noise I had just made with the claw hammer. "It's past midnight on a Tuesday. I'm calling the super. People are trying to sleep in this building." He stopped speaking abruptly. The final syllable caught in his throat, dying before it could fully form. His aggressive gaze had finally adjusted to the dim lighting, shifting rapidly past my small, shivering figure, pressed tightly against the plaster wall, and landing directly on the towering, terrifying monolith standing directly in front of my open apartment door. Nicholas turned his head very slowly. He did not reach for the concealed, holstered weapon resting comfortably beneath the lapel of his tailored charcoal suit jacket. He did not square his massive shoulders in a display of physical intimidation, nor did he issue a loud, aggressive command to force the civilian back into his apartment. He simply looked at the elderly man. The silence that instantly descended upon the narrow hallway was absolute, suffocating, and utterly terrifying. It was the sudden, oppressive, heavy quiet of a deep jungle, the exact moment a true apex predator steps silently into the clearing, and every single prey animal in the vicinity instinctively, simultaneously remembers what raw fear tastes like. I watched in morbid fascination as the blood rapidly, visibly drained from the neighbor's weathered, wrinkled face, leaving his skin the color of old ash. He was an old man who had lived in the gritty, unforgiving underbelly of Boston his entire life. He knew exactly how to differentiate between a loud, pathetic street thug, looking for a quick score, and a man who possessed the untouchable, limitless power to make an entire city block disappear without leaving a single trace of evidence. Nicholas exuded a cold, calculated aura of extreme, untouchable wealth and disciplined, highly organized violence. The flawless bespoke tailoring of his dark suit, the pristine black leather gloves, the sheer, unapologetic, predatory dominance of his relaxed posture. It was a visual language of absolute power that required no verbal translation. "Good evening," Nicholas said. His deep baritone was perfectly polite, smooth as incredibly expensive velvet, yet it carried the undeniable, lethal weight of an executioner's descending blade. He didn't raise his voice a single decibel above a casual, conversational murmur. The extreme, unyielding courtesy of his tone was somehow infinitely more terrifying than a shouted, violent threat. "Maya is currently relocating," he continued calmly, his gray eyes tracking the return of color to the small, trembling sliver of the old man's face visible through the chained doorway. There was no smashing. There were no late-night footsteps to report. In fact, Maya was never a tenant in this building. "You have lived across the hall from an empty, vacant apartment for the last 8 months. Isn't that correct, sir?" It was not a question. It was not a polite suggestion meant to smooth over a neighborly dispute. It was a complete, systematic rewriting of objective reality, delivered with the absolute, chilling authority of a man entirely accustomed to altering the fundamental laws of the world to suit his immediate needs. It was offering the terrified old man a very simple, binary choice. seamlessly accept the new fabricated reality and live comfortably to see the morning sun, or foolishly cling to the truth and instantly become a highly regrettable casualty of an underworld war. His frail hand trembled violently on the painted edge of the door. He swallowed hard, his faded blue eyes darting frantically from Nicholas's impassive, statuesque, terrifying face to the dark, empty void of my abandoned apartment, and then finally dropping down to stare submissively at his own scuffed slippers. "Yes," Mr. Vance whispered, his voice shaking so badly the single, solitary syllable completely fractured in the cold hallway air. "Yes, empty apartment. It always has been. The damn drafts in this old building make strange noises. It is a harsh winter," Nicholas agreed softly, his tone entirely devoid of cruelty or mockery. It was simply the cold, clinical approval of a correct, life-saving tactical decision. "Lock your deadbolt securely tonight, sir. The ambient temperature is expected to drop significantly in the next 10 minutes. It was a thinly veiled warning. The extraction team was coming. The silent, heavily armed perimeter breach was imminent, and anyone caught wandering the halls or peering through keyholes would be immediately categorized as a hostile variable and neutralized. The terrified old man did not need to be told twice. He nodded exactly once, a frantic, jerky motion, and slammed the heavy wooden door shut with astonishing speed. The loud, metallic clatter of the primary deadbolt engaging, instantly followed by a secondary heavy iron latch sliding securely into place, echoed rapidly through the narrow corridor. The sliver of warm, comforting orange light was completely gone. We were alone again in the freezing, flickering gloom of the corridor. I released a ragged, incredibly shaky breath, my restricted lungs burning, as I finally allowed myself to inhale deeply, the scent of cedar cologne filling my senses. I had lived in absolute, paralyzing terror of my ex-husband for a year, a pathetically weak man who screamed, threw heavy glass bottles, and physically threatened neighbors just to assert his fragile, toxic dominance over a space. I had just stood in silence and watched Nicholas Ricchetti flawlessly neutralize a potential civilian witness and secure a highly volatile operational perimeter, using nothing but 40 softly spoken words in absolute, unyielding posture. The raw, unfiltered, terrifying power of it sent a profound jolt of electricity straight to my core, overriding my exhaustion with a surge of sheer awe. Nicholas turned his attention back to me, his focus instantly pivoting from the neutralized external threat back to my fragile physical state. His silver gaze pinning mine with a chilling, absolute certainty as he clinically assessed my white-knuckled grip on the heavy messenger bag, the stark pallor of my skin in the harsh fluorescent lighting, and the way the heavy cashmere coat practically swallowed my small, trembling frame. "Move," he commanded softly, placing his leather-clad hand back on the center of my spine. The pressure was firm, guiding, and utterly undeniable. We moved rapidly toward the dark concrete stairwell at the far end of the hall. I didn't look back at the open door of apartment 4B, nor did I glance at the peeling wallpaper or the dripping faucet I had abandoned. The freezing, rotting apartment was dead to me now. I was finally walking away from the cold, hyper-vigilant exhaustion of my miserable shadow life, guided securely by the firm, immovable hand of the city's most feared kingpin. My heart still hammered wildly against my ribs, but the rhythm was fundamentally different now. The frantic, erratic, suffocating flutter of pure, helpless terror had completely smoothed out into a deep, steady, powerful thud of pure adrenaline. I was descending rapidly into the dark, terrifying, blood-soaked depths of the Boston underworld. But for the very first time in 300 agonizing days, I was absolutely certain I was not walking into the shadows alone. The stairwell was a vertical tunnel of peeling paint and rusted iron railings, plunged into near-total darkness by blown-out security bulbs. Normally, descending these steps at midnight would have triggered every single self-preservation instinct I possessed. I would have gripped my keys tighter, my breath held, constantly scanning the landings for a threat. But tonight, the threat was already walking directly beside me, dictating the pace of our descent with measured, silent strides. Nicholas maintained his physical proximity, his tall frame positioned strategically to shield me from the blind spots of the landings, his leather-gloved hand occasionally brushing my elbow to steady my hurried steps on the uneven concrete. As we reached the ground floor, the heavy steel fire door loomed ahead, its surface battered and marred by decades of neglect. Outside that door lay the freezing, unpredictable labyrinth of the Boston streets, and somewhere in that urban grid, a highly trained syndicate hitman was actively hunting me. The reality of Dante Drago's rifle scope bore heavily on my mind. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, my cotton-socked feet stalling on the final step. Nicholas did not rush me. He stopped precisely when I did. He lifted his left hand to his ear, tapping a sleek, nearly invisible communication device hidden beneath the collar of his suit. "Status," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper against the concrete walls. A brief beat of silence followed, filled only by the ragged sound of my own breathing. Then, the mafia boss lowered his hand, his intense eyes meeting mine with an unyielding, absolute focus that burned through the gloom of the stairwell. "The perimeter is entirely secure," Nicholas stated, his tone carrying that same absolute, unbreakable authority. "My extraction team has neutralized the alleyway. Drago is no longer holding that vantage point. He realized his surveillance was compromised the moment I breached your door. We have a clear corridor to the transport." He reached past me, pushing the heavy steel fire door open. The biting, brutal wind of the Boston winter instantly whipped into the stairwell, carrying the scent of impending snow and freezing asphalt. I braced myself for the shock of the cold, but the heavy wool coat draped over my shoulders held the icy draft entirely at bay. It was a physical manifestation of his power, a mobile sanctuary that kept the harsh reality of the city from ever touching my skin. We stepped out into the dark alleyway. I immediately saw the 4 towering figures dressed in tactical black gear, standing in absolute silence near the rusted fire escape where Dante had been perched just minutes ago. They held suppressed, high-powered rifles, their posture disciplined and alert, their eyes continuously scanning the rooftops. They were Nicholas's men. Highly trained, lethal, and completely loyal. They did not speak to their boss, and he did not address them. A subtle, silent nod from the nearest operative confirmed the sector was clear. Idling at the curb, its headlights cut to avoid drawing civilian attention, was a massive, pitch-black armored SUV. It looked like a military-grade fortress disguised as a luxury vehicle. The rear passenger door was already open, held by another operative whose face was obscured by the shadows. "Inside," Nicholas instructed, his hand resting on my back one final time to guide me into the spacious cabin. I climbed up, the heavy canvas messenger bag clutched tightly against my chest, and sank into the plush, pristine leather of the back seat. The ambient temperature inside the vehicle was perfectly regulated, a wave of deep, encompassing warmth that instantly began to thaw the lingering chill from my bones. A second later, Nicholas slid into the seat beside me, his massive frame taking up the majority of the space, yet somehow making the interior feel intimately safe rather than claustrophobic. The heavy ballistic door slammed shut behind him. The thick, reinforced glass instantly sealed out the howling wind, the distant sirens, and the terrifying reality of the city outside. The silence inside the cabin was absolute, broken only by the low, powerful purr of the armored engine. "Drive," Nicholas commanded quietly. The heavy vehicle surged forward, smoothly navigating the narrow alleyway and pulling out onto the deserted main street. I leaned back against the headrest, the tension slowly, agonizingly beginning to bleed out of my rigid muscles. I was leaving my entire life behind. The cold apartment, the constant fear, the desperate struggle to survive on scraps. I looked over at the man sitting beside me, his profile carved from pure, unforgiving stone as he watched the dark city roll past the tinted windows. "In my world," Nicholas said, his gaze shifting slowly from the window to meet my exhausted eyes, his timbre a dark, gravelly promise that filled the cabin. "When I claim something as mine, I protect it absolutely. You are no longer fighting this war alone, Maya. You are under my roof now." The sheer weight of his vow settled over me, as heavy and warm as the cashmere coat still wrapped around my shoulders. The mafia boss had not just saved my life tonight. He had permanently altered the trajectory of my existence, pulling me out of the freezing shadows and straight into the center of his gilded, untouchable empire. The tinted ballistic glass of the SUV transformed the chaotic, freezing streets of Boston into a muted, silent film. I stared out at the blurred neon lights of passing storefronts and the rhythmic sweep of the vehicle's windshield wipers, my analytical brain desperately attempting to catalog the sensory data of my new reality. The interior of the armored transport smelled of ozone, expensive climate-controlled leather, and the lingering, sharp scent of rain clinging to the tactical gear of the operatives in the front seats. It was a mobile fortress, a staggering contrast to the drafty, rotting apartment I had just abandoned. I sat rigidly against the plush rear seat, my white-knuckled grip still locked around the nylon strap of my canvas messenger bag. The heavy titanium drives containing my encrypted software were safe, resting heavily against my thighs. Beside me, the syndicate head occupied his space, with the relaxed, predatory stillness of a man who possessed absolute authority over his environment. He did not immediately speak again, allowing the profound silence of the soundproofed cabin to stretch between us, giving my hyper-vigilant nervous system a moment to process his lethal vow of protection. But my mind was a specialized machine built for decoding anomalies, and the mathematics of tonight's intrusion simply did not align. "If Dante Drago is a syndicate hitman," I began, my voice a thin, raspy whisper that cut through the low hum of the massive engine. I kept my gaze fixed on the glowing dashboard of the center console, suddenly terrified to look at the towering man beside me. If he possessed a suppressed, high-velocity rifle and a clear line of sight through my uncurtained window, why didn't he simply pull the trigger? I was standing in the center of the kitchen for 10 minutes. I was a completely static target. Nicholas shifted slightly, the expensive charcoal wool of his tailored suit whispering against the leather upholstery. He turned his head, his pale gaze held mine across the dim space with a cold, analytical intensity that felt like physical pressure. "Because you are not a conventional target, Maya," the mafia boss replied, his deep baritone perfectly level, devoid of any comforting platitudes. "Dante Drago is not a blunt instrument deployed for simple executions. He is an acquisition specialist for the Eastern Crew, a rogue operative tasked with identifying and extracting high-value intelligence assets. A sniper's bullet would have destroyed the very asset he was sent to procure." The implications of his statement sent a fresh, icy spike of dread racing down my spine. I finally turned my head to meet his gaze, my breath catching in my throat. "He wanted to abduct me," I stated, the clinical reality of the words tasting like copper on my tongue. "He wanted to leverage you," Nicholas corrected smoothly. He rested his left arm along the center console, the subtle shift in his posture bringing his massive frame just a fraction closer to mine. "The audio file you translated tonight was not a careless mistake made by a low-level courier. It was a highly sophisticated, deliberately planted acoustic trap. The Eastern Crew suspected I was utilizing a forensic linguist to intercept their encrypted burner networks. Drago intentionally broadcast that 42-second clip, utilizing a proxy speaker, hoping my analyst would decode the location of the midnight ambush and trigger a physical response from my enforcers. He was using the wiretap to map the speed and accuracy of my intelligence network. My analytical engine immediately fired, processing the tactical brilliance of the trap. They had fed us a poisoned pawn to expose the queen, but they had fundamentally underestimated the depth of my acoustic analysis. "He didn't realize I would catch the phonetic clipping," I murmured, my eyes widening slightly as the linguistic puzzle pieces snapped into perfect alignment. The speaker was utilizing a localized southern dialect, but the glottal sotops and the respiratory wheeze were entirely manufactured. I isolated a 3-second waveform and identified a micropause between the subject and the predicate that proved the speaker was translating from an Eastern linguistic base in real time. I appended the anomaly report to your secure drop. And that exact anomaly report is what saved 3 of my highest-ranking capos from walking into a slaughter tonight. The syndicate head confirmed quietly. A dark, dangerous respect flickered in the depths of his eyes. A validation of my intellect that sent a strange, involuntary warmth blooming in my chest. "When you exposed the proxy, you effectively blinded Drago's entire operation." He realized immediately that my network was protected by someone possessing a highly specialized, academic-level understanding of acoustic phonetics. You became the single greatest threat to his faction. He tracked of the proxy server relay, isolated your geographic radius, and spent the last 48 hours hunting you down. I swallowed hard, visualizing the terrifying patience of the predator on the fire escape. He was waiting for me to go to sleep. He was waiting for the optimal moment to breach the window, neutralize you with a chemical sedative, and transport you to a black site. Nicholas explained, his tone remaining clinical, though the slight, rigid tightening of his jaw betrayed a lethal undercurrent of anger. Once secured, he would have utilized extreme, prolonged physical coercion to force you to decrypt my internal communications and feed me false intelligence. He intended to turn my most valuable defensive asset into a weapon against my own family. The sheer horrifying magnitude of what I had narrowly escaped crashed down on me. I was a civilian, a freelance translator who had spent a year hiding from a pathetic, abusive ex-husband, mistakenly believing that keeping my head down and my digital footprint erased would guarantee my safety. I had completely failed to comprehend the terrifying scope of the underworld war I was actively participating in. "If I am relocating to your secure infrastructure," I said, my voice trembling but my logic remaining stubbornly intact, "I need raw, unmitigated access to your primary localized servers. I cannot run high-level spectral subtraction algorithms over a remote, heavily firewalled cloud connection. The latency will degrade the audio fidelity, and I will miss the microtremors in the vocal cords." I lifted my chin, forcing myself to meet the intimidating weight of his gaze. "I'm not negotiating the terms of my surrender. I'm clarifying the job description. If you expect perfection, I require the proper hardware." The mafia boss stared at me for a long, silent moment. I expected him to reprimand my sudden demands, to remind me that he had just saved my life, and I was in no position to issue ultimatums to a kingpin. Instead, the faint ghost of a smirk touched the corner of his mouth, a devastatingly attractive, quiet acknowledgement of my resilience. "Your technical requirements will be met unconditionally," he stated softly. "You will have a localized, air-gapped server array built to your exact specifications before sunrise." I nodded once, a sharp, jerky motion. I had secured my operational value. I had proven my competence. But the moment the logistical problem was solved, the highly concentrated adrenaline that had been keeping me conscious and functional for the last hour suddenly violently abandoned my bloodstream. Cortisol is a high-interest loan drawn against the nervous system, and my debt had just been called in. The physical crash was immediate and devastating. It started as a faint, icy prickle at the base of my skull, and rapidly cascaded down my spine. Despite the deep, luxurious warmth of the heavy wool coat wrapped around me, and the perfectly regulated climate control of the SUV, I felt as though I had been plunged into a bath of liquid nitrogen. The freezing sensation bypassed my skin entirely, settling deep into the marrow of my bones. My fingers, still clutching the canvas bag, began to tremble. It wasn't a slight nervous shake. It was a violent, uncontrollable distal tremor. I tried to release my grip, but my muscles had locked into a state of rigid tetany. The shivering quickly spread to my arms, my shoulders, and finally my jaw, my teeth chattering together with a harsh, audible clicking sound that echoed embarrassingly in the quiet cabin. My breathing hitched, the rhythm entirely shattered. I was taking short, rapid, shallow gasps, unable to pull enough oxygen past the tight, panicked constriction in my chest. The edges of my vision began to darken, the bright neon lights outside the tinted glass blurring into meaningless streaks of color. I squeezed my eyes shut, mortified by my sudden physical collapse. I crossed my arms tightly over my chest, desperately trying to manually compress my shivering frame and hide my profound weakness from the lethal predator sitting mere inches away. I had survived the confrontation. I had survived the extraction. It was utterly humiliating to fall apart now, when the immediate danger had passed. But Nicholas Urquetti possessed a hyper-observance that bordered on the supernatural. He did not need to ask if I was unwell. He read the catastrophic failure of my somatic defenses before I even fully registered it myself. He did not bark an order to the driver to speed up. He did not call for a medical team. He simply moved. The heavy leather upholstery shifted as he closed the remaining physical distance between us. He reached out, his movements incredibly slow and deliberately telegraphed to ensure my panicked brain did not interpret his approach as an attack. He firmly grasped my trembling wrists, gently but immovably prying my locked fingers away from the strap of my messenger bag. I flinched, a sharp, involuntary gasp escaping my lips as the bag slid off my lap onto the floorboards. "Look at me." "Maya," he commanded. His words dropped to a deep, hypnotic register, a deep, resonant hum designed to anchor a spiraling mind. I forced my heavy, burning eyelids open. His face was entirely too close, dominating my field of vision. The harsh lines of his jaw were softened by the dim, ambient glow of the dashboard, but his silver gaze fiercely alert. He had removed his bespoke leather gloves, his large, bare hands wrapped completely around my freezing, trembling ones. The thermal transfer was instantaneous. His skin was incredibly warm, the calluses on his palms a stark, tactile reminder of the violent, physical nature of his power. "You are experiencing an acute adrenaline crash," he stated clinically, though his thumbs began to stroke slow, rhythmic circles against the fragile, blue-veined skin of my inner wrists, right over my frantic pulse points. "Your sympathetic nervous system is resetting. It is a standard physiological response to survival. Do not attempt to fight the tremors. Let them pass. I can't breathe, I stammered, the words fracturing into broken syllables as my chest heaved erratically. It's too cold. I'm too cold. You are not cold. Your blood is simply prioritizing your vital organs, Nicholas corrected gently. He shifted his grip, releasing my left hand to reach up and securely grasp the back of my neck. His palm was a heavy, branding iron of heat pressing directly against my cervical spine. The physical contact was shocking, short-circuiting the frantic, chaotic misfires of my panic attack. He exerted a firm, steady pressure, physically forcing me to lean forward slightly, breaking the rigid, defensive lock of my posture. Match my breathing, he ordered softly, the absolute authority in his tone leaving absolutely no room for failure. Inhale for 4 seconds. Pause for 2. Exhale for 6. I shook my head frantically, my vision tunneling further. I can't. You can, he interrupted, his inflection a soft, steady rumble meant to anchor my spiraling panic. I am right here. You are completely secure. No one is watching you from the shadows. No one is standing outside your door. You are entirely untouchable. Breathe, Maya. He inhaled deeply, his massive chest expanding in a slow, controlled rhythm. Desperate for a lifeline, my traumatized body instinctively latched onto his mechanical precision. I dragged a jagged, ragged breath of air into my burning lungs, my chest rising in a desperate attempt to mirror his steady cadence. The scent of cedar and winter ozone flooded my senses, acting as a powerful olfactory anchor that pushed away the phantom smells of damp plaster and cheap bleach. Good, he murmured, his thumb continuing to trace slow, grounding arcs across my wrist. Keep it in, now exhale. I let the air rush out in a long, shaky sigh. The violent shivering racking my shoulders slowly began to subside, downgrading from a chaotic convulsion to a manageable, deep tissue tremor. The luxurious winter jacket wrapped around me finally seemed to trap the heat he was transferring into my skin. The suffocating band of pressure around my ribs loosened, allowing the next breath to come easier. We sat in that highly intimate, deeply unconventional state of physical grounding for several long minutes as the armored SUV navigated the dark, rain-slicked highways of the city. He did not release his firm grasp on my neck, nor did he pull his warm hand away from my wrist. He maintained the firm, unyielding physical contact with the absolute patience of a man, completely unbothered by the passage of time. He was acting as a human thermal blanket, manually regulating my shattered nervous system with his own immense, untouchable stability. It was a profound, terrifying paradox. The man who ordered executions, who dismantled rival empires with cold, calculated cruelty, was currently treating my fragile physical state with the meticulous, highly observant care of a trauma surgeon. He respected my boundaries by maintaining a strictly clinical pressure, yet the sheer overwhelming possessiveness of his actions was undeniable. He had claimed my safety as his personal responsibility, and he was executing that duty with flawless precision. As my heart rate finally settled into a normal, steady rhythm, the intense, overwhelming exhaustion returned, settling heavily into my bones. I slumped back against the plush leather seat, my head lolling slightly to the side. Nicholas allowed the shift, his hand sliding smoothly from the back of my neck to casually rest on the leather upholstery just behind my shoulder, maintaining a protective, hovering proximity. I stared blankly at the dark ceiling of the cabin, the reality of my new existence slowly settling over me. Loved ones are targets, liabilities. Anyone in my position knows better than to give the world that kind of leverage. I had lived by that cruel, isolating rule for nearly a year, terrified that my mere existence would bring violence to my sister's doorstep. But tonight, that rule had been completely rewritten. I was no longer a solitary, vulnerable liability. I was a highly protected asset, shielded by a network that possessed the power to crush any threat before it even materialized. I thought about the simple, innocent selfie that had triggered this entire avalanche of chaos. I had posted it to prove to Elena that I was safe. The irony was bitter but strangely poetic. The photograph had exposed my darkest vulnerability, but it had also summoned the ultimate protector to my door. Some stories didn't have neat endings. Some involved living daily in spaces between right and wrong, justice and compromise, love and complications. I was a brilliant, highly educated forensic linguist who had just willingly surrendered her total autonomy to the most dangerous mafia don in New England. It was a dark, morally complex compromise, but as the ambient heat of the cabin finally chased the last lingering traces of ice from my veins, I knew I would make the exact same choice again. The armored transport banked smoothly down a secluded, highly secured private ramp, the heavy metal security gates closing automatically behind us, sealing out the depth of the world. The deep rumbling hum of the engine echoed off the pristine concrete walls of an underground facility. We had arrived. I turned my head slightly, my exhausted, heavy eyes meeting Nicholas's storm-colored eyes in the dim light of the garage. He was already looking at me, his expression perfectly calm, a silent, unbreakable sentinel waiting for me to catch my breath. I was no longer a ghost hiding in the freezing rain. I was visible, I was valued, and I was absolutely, undeniably safe. The silence inside the armored SUV was absolute, a heavy pressurized vacuum that completely severed me from the violent reality of the Boston winter. When the massive engine finally cut off, the sudden absence of its low, powerful vibration left a ringing emptiness in my ears. We were parked deep beneath the earth. The underground facility was bathed in a stark, clinical white light that reflected off the pristine, polished concrete floor. It did not look like a parking garage. It looked like the staging area of a highly classified military bunker. Nicholas did not wait for his operatives to open his door. He moved with that same terrifying, liquid grace, pushing the heavy ballistic door open and stepping out into the subterranean chill. The ambient air here was dry and meticulously filtered, carrying the faint, metallic scent of gun oil and high-octane fuel, instead of the damp rot I was accustomed to in my crumbling apartment. I remained frozen on the plush leather seat for 3 agonizing seconds. My brain transmitted the command to move, to gather my heavy canvas messenger bag and exit the vehicle. But my body stubbornly refused to comply. The cortisol debt was still ravaging my nervous system. My legs felt entirely hollow, as if the bones had been replaced with fragile, trembling glass. I tightened my white-knuckled grip on the nylon strap of my bag, desperately attempting to force my locked muscles into compliance. For 300 days I had lived entirely off the grid. I had survived by relying on absolutely no one, navigating the darkest, most terrifying corners of my existence under my own power. Asking for help was not just a vulnerability, it was a fundamental failure of my operational security. My sister Elena was the only person who knew I was still breathing, and even she only saw the curated, sanitized version of my life. But Nicholas Ricchetti did not wait for me to ask. He appeared in the open doorway of the SUV, his massive frame completely eclipsing the harsh overhead lights. He had draped his suit jacket back perfectly over his shoulders, the bespoke charcoal wool immaculate despite the chaos of the extraction. He looked down at me, his slate eyes instantly cataloging the rigid defensive lock of my posture, and the faint, uncontrollable tremor vibrating through my knees. He didn't offer a patronizing smile. He didn't ask if I was capable of walking. He simply extended his large, bare hand toward me. The transition from extreme adrenaline to baseline safety is physically disorienting, Nicholas stated, his deep baritone echoing softly against the concrete walls. Your equilibrium is compromised. Take my hand, Maya. I will not let you fall. It was a tactical assessment delivered as a vow. I stared at his palm, wide, calloused, and radiating a deep, grounding heat. I swallowed the bitter, acidic taste of my own pride. I reached out, my small freezing fingers slipping into his grasp. The moment our skin connected, his long fingers closed securely around mine, locking our physical connection with the unyielding strength of industrial steel. He pulled gently, providing the exact amount of leverage necessary to assist my ascent without completely overtaking my center of gravity. I stepped out of the vehicle. My scuffed, damp canvas shoes met the immaculate concrete. My knees immediately buckled, a violent, involuntary somatic betrayal, as the cortisol crash finally hit my bloodstream. Nicholas moved faster than my brain could process. His free hand shot out, the warm palm catching the side of my waist, his long fingers pressing firmly through the thick layers of the heavy wool coat I still wore. He absorbed my entire shifting weight effortlessly, anchoring me to his side like a structural support beam. Steady, he murmured, his voice a low rumble vibrating near my ear. I dragged in a sharp, ragged breath, the intoxicating scent of cedar and ozone flooding my senses and pushing back the edges of my dizziness. I'm fine. It's just the cold. It is the shock, he corrected smoothly, not loosening his grip on my waist a single fraction. Do not attempt to rationalize a physiological collapse. Lean on me. We began to walk. The 4 tactical operatives who had ridden in the front of the vehicle had already fanned out, establishing a flawless, silent perimeter around us. Their suppressed rifles were held at the low ready, their eyes constantly scanning the empty facility. It was an overwhelming display of absolute, coordinated power, all orbiting around the man, currently matching his long, measured strides to my faltering steps. We approached a massive, featureless steel door set into the far wall. There was no handle, there was no keyhole. Instead, a sleek, black biometric panel glowed faintly in the concrete. My analytical mind instantly went to work, desperately seeking refuge in the familiar, logical structure of technology. I recognized the manufacturer of the scanner. It was a proprietary air-gapped optical relay system, typically reserved for federal black sites, designed to read both retinal patterns and underlying vascular structures. It was mathematically impossible to spoof. Nicholas stopped in front of the panel. He did not release his hold on my waist. He simply leaned forward slightly, aligning his right eye with the scanner. A thin, horizontal beam of red laser light swept across his iris. A microsecond later, a heavy, metallic clunk reverberated through the thick steel, followed by the smooth hiss of pneumatic hydraulics. The massive doors parted silently, revealing the interior of a private elevator lined in dark, brushed tungsten and smoked glass. He guided me inside. The doors closed behind us, instantly cutting off the visual of the armed guards and sealing us in a perfectly soundproofed cube. The elevator began its ascent. There was no sensation of movement, no mechanical grinding of cables, only a sudden heavy pressure in my inner ear that indicated we were traveling upward at an incredible velocity. We were entirely alone. The silence in the small sea-space was absolute, thick and heavy, pressing against my eardrums. I stood rigidly beside him, the heavy canvas bag digging into my hip. The terrifying reality of my situation finally began to crystallize. I was ascending into the personal sanctuary of a syndicate kingpin. The fragile, invisible life I had fought so hard to maintain was entirely incinerated. I had traded the danger of the streets for the absolute, inescapable gravity of Nicholas Urquetti. My hand instinctively moved to the front pocket of my worn jeans. My fingers brushed against the cracked glass screen of my cheap smartphone, the device that had caused this entire avalanche of chaos. The innocent selfie sent to my sister, the fatal reflection in the window, the digital footprint that Dante Drago had tracked. It was a liability. A screaming beacon in the dark. I pulled the phone out. My hand was shaking so badly. The device rattled faintly against the metal zipper of my pocket. Nicholas turned his head, his gray eyes tracking the return of color to the cracked plastic casing in my palm. The atmosphere in the elevator instantly shifted, the temperature seemingly dropping by 10 degrees as his predatory focus locked onto the unsecure hardware. "The localized GPS is disabled," I said quickly, my voice sounding incredibly small in the tungsten cube, desperately trying to prove my competence even now. "I use a triple-layered VPN and the messaging app is end-to-end encrypted. But Drago knows the MAC address. He knows the digital signature of the hardware. If he intercepted the image, he likely logged the device's unique identifiers." I held the phone out to him. It was a complete surrender of my only connection to the outside world, a terrifying severing of my lifeline to Elena. But in this world, his world, vulnerabilities were fatal. Nicholas did not hesitate. He took the phone from my trembling fingers. His massive hands dwarfed the cheap device. He didn't ask for my passcode. He didn't bother attempting a digital wipe. He simply placed his thumbs on the center of the screen and applied a sudden, terrifying amount of localized pressure. Crack. The sound was sharp and violent. The structural integrity of the device failed instantly. The lithium-ion battery hissed faintly. As the motherboard snapped in half, the Gorilla Glass shattering into a spiderweb of useless, jagged shards. He folded the destroyed hardware over onto itself with brutal, effortless strength, effectively rendering the memory chips and the SIM card into unrecoverable digital ash. He dropped the mangled remains of my past into the deep pocket of his trousers. The selfie was merely the final physical confirmation he needed to breach your perimeter. Nicholas stated, his tone completely flat, unaffected by the violence of the action. "The coded wiretap ledger you were transcribing tonight, Maya. It was a fabrication. A highly sophisticated acoustic trap deliberately leaked by Dante Drago." The tungsten walls of the elevator seemed to press inward. I stared up at him, my heart stuttering against my ribs. "A trap? Drago is a blunt instrument, but his surveillance contractors are not," Nicholas explained. His metallic eyes met mine with a chilling, absolute certainty. He knew my syndicate utilized an unprecedented forensic linguist. He wanted to identify, abduct, and exploit you to blind my operations. He leaked an audio file embedded with a sub-audible frequency beacon, a digital snare hidden inside the encrypted communications. I stopped breathing. The mathematics of my failure cascaded through my mind. When you downloaded the file and ran it through your spectral subtraction algorithms. Nicholas continued, his voice a low, steady rumble meant to anchor my spiraling panic. The decoding process triggered a localized ping. It gave him a 3-block radius of your IP's physical location. The reflection of his silhouette in the window of your selfie? That was him verifying the exact apartment number before making entry. You were not negligent, Maya, you were hunted. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The very work I prided myself on, my flawless linguistic analysis, had been weaponized against me. Dante Drago hadn't just stumbled upon my life. He had laid a meticulously calculated snare for my intellect. Your digital footprint is now permanently erased, Nicholas said smoothly, breaking through my shock. You will no longer use compromised hardware. Elena will be contacted through a secure, air-gapped relay that I will establish for you tomorrow morning. Until then, you do not exist on any grid. I stared at the space in his hand where my phone had been. A strange, hollow sensation bloomed in my chest. Some stories didn't have neat endings. Some involved living daily in spaces between right and wrong, justice and compromise, love and complications. I had just watched a mob boss physically crush my independence, and yet, the overwhelming emotion flooding my system was not anger. It was a profound, staggering relief. The responsibility of maintaining my own survival, of constantly looking over my shoulder, of managing the crushing paranoia. He had just taken it from me. He had snapped it in half and placed the burden entirely onto his own massive shoulders. Thank you, I whispered, the words slipping out before I could censor them. Nicholas looked at me, a dark, intense emotion flickering briefly in his eyes before he carefully locked it away. I do not require gratitude, Maya. I require your compliance with my security protocols. In my world, when I claim something as mine, I protect it absolutely. You are the architect of my intelligence network. You will be treated as the crown jewel of this empire. The elevator slowed, the intense G-force easing as we reached the apex of the building. Ding. The brushed tungsten doors slid open silently, and the sensory assault of Nicholas Urquetti's true reality washed over me. I stepped tentatively out of the elevator and directly into a sprawling, multi-level penthouse that defied every parameter of logic and architecture I understood. The entire northern wall was constructed of massive, seamless panes of floor-to-soiling bulletproof glass, offering a staggering, panoramic view of the Boston Harbor and the city skyline. The winter storm was raging violently outside, snowflakes swirling in chaotic, aggressive vortexes against the glass. But inside the sanctuary, it was entirely silent. The engineering required to dampen the acoustic assault of a blizzard at this altitude was astronomical. The contrast was dizzying. Barely an hour ago, I had been standing in a cramped, rotting kitchen, shivering in a pilling sweater, while a leaking faucet dripped rhythmically onto cracked linoleum. Now, I was standing on polished, imported black marble that radiated a deep, encompassing thermal heat through the soles of my damp canvas shoes. The expansive living space was anchored by a massive, dual-sided fireplace constructed of dark slate, where thick logs of real cedar wood crackled and burned, casting a soft, flickering golden glow across the room. The air smelled of wood smoke, expensive leather upholstery, and the faint, pristine scent of high-altitude rain. It was not merely a luxurious apartment. It was a highly fortified, perfectly isolated kingdom in the sky. I took another step forward, the heavy wool coat still draped over my shoulders, dragging slightly against the flawless marble. I felt like a trespasser, a feral, wounded animal dragged into a museum of modern art. The sheer scale of his wealth was intimidating, a physical manifestation of the immense power gap between us. The environmental controls are calibrated to your current physical state, Nicholas said, stepping out of the elevator behind me. The doors hissed shut, sealing the lock. The ambient temperature is elevated to counteract your hypothermia and adrenal fatigue. If it becomes oppressive, tell me. I shook my head slowly, my eyes tracking the dark, vaulted ceiling and the minimalist, aggressive angles of the custom furniture. It is. It is perfectly warm. It's overwhelming. It is secure, he corrected gently, walking past me toward the center of the room. He did not ask if I wanted a tour. He did not offer me a drink from the glowing backlit crystal decanters resting on the onyx bar. He operated with a terrifying singular focus on stabilizing my physical and operational capacity. Control, Nicholas said aloud, his voice carrying easily through the vast, quiet space. I flinched, my eyes darting frantically around the empty room, my hypervigilance instantly flaring at the prospect of another person in the penthouse. I saw no one. Yes, Mr. Ricchetti, a polite, distinctly human female voice replied smoothly from a concealed acoustic array integrated into the ceiling architecture. Maya will require a highly caloric, easily digestible meal. Broth, lean protein. Have it brought to the secondary library in exactly 15 minutes. No staff are to enter the primary visual perimeter. Leave the tray on the transition cart. Understood, sir. The voice clicked off. He managed a fully staffed household with the same cold, absolute precision he used to manage his syndicate. He was actively insulating me from unnecessary human contact, recognizing that my traumatized nervous system could not handle the unpredictability of strangers right now. His level of somatic observation was staggering. He was anticipating my psychological triggers before I even felt them. Nicholas turned to face me, his hands sliding into the pockets of his tailored trousers. You are exhausted. Your cognitive functions are currently running on the fumes of survival instinct. But I know you. Maya, I know the clinical architecture of your mind. If I put you in a guest bedroom right now, you will not sleep. You will lie awake, analyzing the security of the doors, the structural integrity of the glass, and the status of your hardware. I tightened my grip on the canvas bag containing my crushed backup drives and my encrypted primary servers. He was entirely correct. My paranoia was a living, breathing entity. I could not simply shut down my operational awareness just because the environment looked expensive. Loved ones are targets, liabilities. Anyone in my position knows better than to give the world that kind of leverage, I said softly, adapting the harsh, solitary, defensive philosophy I had adopted for so long. I looked up at him, my chin lifting defensively. My data is my only leverage. My intellect is the only reason Dante Drago is hunting me, and it is the only reason you brought me here. I need to know my equipment is secure. I need to know I am not just a prisoner in a very expensive gilded cage. Nicholas did not blink. He did not take offense at my implication. Instead, the faint, dangerous ghost of a smile returned to his features, softening the cruel, aristocratic angles of his jaw. You are not a prisoner, Maya. You are the architect. He turned and began walking toward the eastern wing of the penthouse, his long, deliberate strides commanding the space. He did not look back to see if I was following. He knew the gravity of his promise would pull me along. I trailed behind him, the expansive fabric shifting against my calves, the canvas bag bumping against my thigh. We passed down a wide, warmly lit corridor lined with abstract, dark-toned art pieces that I lacked the cognitive capacity to appreciate. We stopped in front of a pair of heavy, solid mahogany double doors. Nicholas pushed them open. I stepped over the threshold and immediately stopped breathing. It was a library, but calling it a library was a gross understatement of its function. It was a highly fortified, technologically supreme command center designed specifically for acoustic analysis. The walls were lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, but the true focal point was the massive, custom-built desk positioned in the center of the room. Resting on the dark, polished wood was a brand-new, multi-monitor array. 4 curved, high-definition OLED screens were mounted on hydraulic arms, perfectly calibrated to display the vast, complex topographical maps of spectral subtraction algorithms. Beneath the desk sat the matte black tower of the disconnected server unit. My forensic mind immediately began scanning the specifications of the hardware. The cooling fans were entirely silent, indicating liquid nitrogen thermal regulation. The cabling was heavily shielded, braided with copper mesh to prevent any electromagnetic interference from altering the delicate phonetic frequencies I analyzed. There were no wireless network cards installed. The entire system was a closed, impenetrable loop. I intercepted your architectural requests from the dark web proxy logs 3 months ago. Nicholas stated quietly from the doorway, his baritone filling the acoustic perfection of the room. You complained to a hardware vendor about the latency of your processing core when rendering phase vocoding on encrypted channels. I had my logistics team procure this system that same night. It has been sitting in this room, entirely disconnected from the grid, waiting for the inevitable day your shadow was compromised. I turned slowly to look at him, my jaw slightly slack, the sheer magnitude of his calculated patience crashing into me. He hadn't just saved me from a hitman on a fire escape. He had been meticulously constructing a fortress for my intellect for a quarter of a year. He had seen the brilliance of my work, recognized the absolute necessity of my skills, and built a sanctuary tailored exactly to my professional dignity. Competence is the ultimate currency. In a world dominated by violence and physical intimidation, my ability to decipher the invisible, auditory architecture of his enemies had elevated me to a status untouchable by physical force. He didn't just want to protect a fragile, trembling woman. He wanted to shield a tactical genius. I walked slowly toward the desk. I unzipped my heavy canvas messenger bag and carefully lifted the intact, titanium-cased solid-state drives containing my life's work. The metal was cold against my palms. I set them gently onto the polished mahogany surface, right next to the massive, silent server tower. The physical action was incredibly symbolic. It was the absolute relinquishing of my solitary burden. I was plugging my existence into his infrastructure. I turned back to face the kingpin. He was watching me with a gaze so intensely possessive, so deeply anchored in absolute certainty, that it made the breath catch in my throat all over again. "The hardware is secure," I whispered, the final, lingering knot of hypervigilant panic in my chest beginning to unravel, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. "The data is safe." "Yes," Nicholas agreed softly. He stepped into the room, the immense paneled doors closing automatically behind him with a soft, definitive click, sealing us inside the fortress he had built for me. "The data is safe, and so are you." He closed the distance between us, his massive frame radiating that intense, grounding heat. He reached out, his long fingers gently grasping the heavy lapels of the massive bespoke overcoat that was still drowning my small frame. He didn't pull the coat off. He simply adjusted it, ensuring the collar sat snugly against my freezing neck, a deeply domestic, protective gesture that completely stripped away his terrifying underworld persona, leaving only the man who had promised to stand between me and the dark. "Welcome home, Maya." Outside the bulletproof glass, the freezing Boston blizzard continued its violent assault against the city. But inside the penthouse, wrapped in the scent of cedar and the absolute, unyielding protection of the most formidable boss in the world, the cold could no longer reach me. The thick wooden doors of the acoustic library remained securely sealed behind us, locking out the raging Boston blizzard and the violent, unpredictable chaos of the underworld. I stood in the exact center of the vast room, my damp canvas shoes resting on the thick, sound-dampening Persian rug. Nicholas Ricchetti's thick charcoal topcoat was still draped securely around my trembling shoulders, a physical sensory fortress smelling of sharp winter ozone, cedar, and expensive leather. The sheer weight of the garment pressed down on my collarbones, a tactile anchor holding me firmly in reality. His words echoed in the pristine acoustic environment, vibrating against my exhausted ribcage with the force of a tectonic shift. Home. For 8 long, agonizing months, my definition of that word had been a freezing, water-damaged slum in the roughest part of the city. A place where I slept with one eye open, terrified of every creaking floorboard and every shadow passing under the doorframe. I had spent nearly a year clinging to a fragile, paper-thin illusion of safety, deciphering the coded wiretap ledger by the light of a single flickering bulb, praying my cheap deadbolts would hold against the monsters lurking in the dark. My brain, heavily traumatized and running on adrenaline fumes, struggled to reconcile the staggering luxury of this room with the terrifying reality I had occupied barely an hour ago. The transition from prey to protected asset had been so incredibly violent, so ruthlessly efficient, that my memory of it felt like a fragmented, high-speed tactical recording. Back in the slums, I had quickly gathered my forensic translation files, while Nicholas systematically swept my apartment with cold, clinical efficiency to make sure nothing dangerous was left behind. He had operated with a lethal, absolute precision that completely dismantled my hypervigilance. And I remembered how, as we slipped out into the hallway, we had encountered my elderly neighbor, Mr. Vance, had braced for disaster, for the police to be called, for the entire delicate house of cards to collapse. Instead, Nicholas had managed the brief interaction with terrifyingly polite dominance to ensure no alarm was raised, forcing the terrified old man to accept a fabricated reality where I had never even existed. That life was over. The ghost I had been forced to play was dead. I exhaled a long, shaky breath of residual tension slowly bleeding out of my cervical spine. I turned my attention away from the grand entryway and toward the massive, custom-built desk dominating the room. The 4 curved, high-definition OLED screens, mounted on hydraulic arms, stared back at me, a blank, glowing canvas waiting for my command. The hardware is fully initialized, Nicholas stated quietly, his baritone a low, steady rumble that instantly grounded my racing thoughts. He walked toward the edge of the desk, his hands resting casually in the pockets of his tailored charcoal trousers. He did not hover over me. He maintained a respectful, deliberate distance, allowing me the spatial autonomy I desperately needed to reassert my professional dignity. It is completely severed from the external grid. The power supply is routed through a localized, heavily shielded subterranean generator. You have absolute digital sovereignty in this room, Maya. I nodded, my fingers twitching with a sudden, overwhelming need to engage with the technology. I stepped forward, the heavy wool coat shifting against my calves, and slid into the ergonomic, high-backed leather chair positioned behind the monitors. It was perfectly calibrated, supporting my aching lumbar spine, with a firm, yielding pressure that made me want to weep with relief. The environment was engineered for absolute focus, a stark contrast to the grueling double shifts at the diner and the constant gnawing fear of discovery that had defined my entire adult existence. I reached out and pressed the primary ignition switch on the matte black tower of the air-gapped server array. The response was instantaneous, yet entirely silent. There was no grinding of cheap hard drives, no whining of overworked cooling fans struggling to process the data load. The custom-built silent heat sinks and industrial cooling fans engaged with a faint, imperceptible hum, a testament to the staggering amount of capital he had invested in this single piece of enterprise-grade machinery. The 4 curved screens flared to life simultaneously, bathing my pale face and the dark wood of the desk in a crisp, surgical blue light. It was a rigorous, highly specialized forensic workstation designed for elite military or corporate data analysis, not a makeshift rig that constantly threatened to overheat and burn my meager apartment down. I didn't hesitate. I unzipped the canvas messenger bag resting on the mahogany surface and carefully extracted the solid-state drives containing my encrypted proprietary software. I traced the raised edges of the encrypted titanium USB key hanging from its reinforced lanyard around my neck. Only 2 hours ago, I had been standing in my drafty kitchen, snapping that one innocent selfie to send to Elena. A simple, stupid digital proof of life, to assure my younger sister that I was surviving, that the grueling isolation hadn't broken me yet. Elena, sheltered and anxious, living 3 states away, had been completely unaware that her need for a photo had inadvertently captured the reflection of a syndicate hitman lurking outside my window. That single image had summoned Nicholas Ricchetti to my door, completely collapsing the precarious, invisible life I had constructed. My cracked smartphone was gone now, crushed into powder by Nicholas's bare hands in the elevator, to prevent any localized tracking. But the memory of Dante Drago's silhouette, looming in the background of that photo, remained burned into my retinas. If I hadn't taken that picture, Dante would have breached my deadbolts before morning. I plugged the encrypted titanium USB key into the secure terminal port on the primary hub. The system recognized the biometric signature instantly. The stark, high-resolution spectral graphs of my acoustic analysis software, populating across the massive digital real estate in a matter of milliseconds. The processing power was unfathomable. What would have taken my old rig 3 hours of agonizing, overheating strain to compile was loaded and stabilized in microseconds. There was no lag, no buffering, just pure, unadulterated computational dominance. Dante Drago used the wiretap as a trap, I murmured, my voice dropping into the clinical, detached cadence I always adopted when working a highly sensitive decryption. I wasn't speaking to Nicholas directly. I was verbalizing the mathematical architecture of the problem to keep my panic at bay. I leaned forward, letting the glow of the monitors consume my visual field. He leaked the 42-second audio file, containing the sub-audible frequency beacon. Knowing my spectral subtraction algorithms would isolate the ambient noise floor and trigger the tracking ping. He weaponized my own methodology against me. He knew I wouldn't be able to resist a linguistic puzzle that complex. I pulled the coded wiretap ledger apart, completely unaware that it was designed to broadcast my exact physical coordinates the moment I stripped the encryption. A highly effective snare. The syndicate head agreed softly. The leather of his expensive bespoke shoes creaked faintly as he shifted his stance, moving just into the edge of my peripheral vision. It utilized your own exceptional competence as the triggering mechanism. Yes, I replied, my fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard with practiced, surgical precision. The tactile click of the keys was sharp, definitive, and deeply satisfying. But if Dante intentionally engineered the file to be intercepted, he had to route it through a digital proxy to mask the origin of the sub-audible beacon. An operative of his violent nature relies on brute force and contracted surveillance tech. He is a blunt instrument. He didn't build the beacon himself. I dragged the original, uncorrupted audio file from the coded wiretap ledger into the primary processing window. The jagged, neon green topographical map of the sound frequencies instantly materialized against the pitch-black background of the left monitor. I stared at the data, letting the visual representation of the ambient noise wash over my senses, searching for the anomaly. The visual was chaotic at first, a sprawling digital jungle of overlaid waveforms, false vocal spikes, and intentional static designed to bury the truth. But this was my domain. Every sound had a distinct mathematical weight, a structural integrity that could be isolated, measured, and stripped bare. I was no longer the terrified woman clutching a destroyed phone in the dark. I was a forensic linguist dismantling the architecture of my enemy. "What are you looking for, Maya?" Nicholas asked. His tone was not impatient. It was deeply observant, laced with a dark, intense fascination, as he watched me dismantle the invisible structure of his enemies. He wasn't just guarding my physical body. He was studying the exact nature of my brilliance, validating the intellect I had been forced to hide for so long. "A mistake," I stated flatly. I highlighted the exact 3-second waveform, where the proxy speaker had utilized the false Eastern dialect markers. But instead of running a standard phase vocoding protocol to stretch the syllables, I initiated a deep-layer algorithmic inversion. I forced the software to strip away the primary vocals entirely, isolating the underlying digital framework of the file itself. The isolated offline server matrix didn't even flinch at the immense computational load. Back in my freezing apartment, my makeshift rig would have overheated, the cooling fans screaming as the processor struggled to render the mathematics. Here, the industrial cooling fans simply maintained their imperceptible rotation, absorbing the thermal spike in absolute silence. The progress bar shot from 0 to 100% in exactly 4 seconds. The beacon Dante used operated on a 15 Hz frequency, I explained, my eyes tracking the rapidly shifting data cascades on the right monitor, my heart rate steadying as the logic anchored me. It is below the threshold of human hearing, designed to piggyback on the low-frequency rumble of the electrical transformer in the audio's background. But when you compress an audio file to transmit it over an encrypted burner network, the compression algorithm invariably creates microscopic artifacts, digital scarring. I hit the spacebar. The visual interface zoomed in, magnifying the 15 Hz wavelength until it filled the entire central screen. It was a beautiful, terrifying piece of data visualization. "There," I whispered, a sharp thrill of intellectual triumph piercing through my physical exhaustion. Embedded within the smooth, undulating curve of the sub-audible beacon was a jagged microscopic spike. It was a secondary transmission echo, a tiny, fragmented piece of data that had failed to compress properly when Dante's surveillance contractor uploaded the trap to the dark web. "What is that?" Nicholas stepped slightly closer, his massive presence leaning into my space without crowding it. The scent of winter ozone and cedar washed over me again, a physical reminder of the absolute security surrounding my workstation. I could feel the heat radiating off his body, a steady grounding force in the silent library. "It is the digital footprint of the router used to upload the file," I said, my pulse kicking up a steady, calculated notch. The contractor used a localized IP masking protocol, but the hardware MAC address bled into the audio compression. It is fragmented, broken into partial hexadecimal chunks, but with this processing power. I ran a rapid reassembly protocol, utilizing a forensic linguistic matrix originally designed to reconstruct corrupted syllables from wiretaps, but applying the logic to the binary code instead. The screens flashed in rapid succession, tearing through thousands of permutations in the blink of an eye. The chaotic noise smoothed out. The metallic distortion vanished entirely. A string of 12 alphanumeric characters populated in the center of the primary display in stark white font. "It's a MAC address," I confirmed, my voice steady, anchored by the undeniable weight of empirical data. And because the sub-audible beacon was designed to transmit a localized ping, the origin router has to be positioned within a specific geographic relay to receive the bounce back. I am cross-referencing the MAC address against the municipal telecom registry for the South End grid. I hit enter. The system bypassed the standard firewalls of the city's infrastructure with terrifying ease, a direct result of the Ricchetti family's unlimited digital access and financial leverage. A precise, glowing red coordinate materialized on a digital map of the Boston Harbor. The waterfront logistics facility, I read aloud, translating the raw geographic data into physical space. I turned my chair slightly to look up at him, my hands falling away from the keyboard. It is an abandoned commercial structure near the water. That is where the surveillance contractor is operating the network. That is the hub tracking the beacon. Nicholas stared at the glowing red dot on the monitor. The silence that followed was heavy, lethal, and fundamentally terrifying. It was not the chaotic, unpredictable silence of an abuser, brooding before a violent outburst. It was the vast, calculated silence of a master tactician, analyzing a sudden, fatal vulnerability in the enemy's armor. The mafia boss did not smile, but the subtle, rigid tension in his masseter muscle indicated a high degree of suppressed, predatory satisfaction. He had brought me to his fortress to protect a vulnerable asset. I had just handed him the exact coordinates to surgically dismantle the men hunting me. I had weaponized my intellect, transforming myself from a fleeing victim into an indispensable partner in his underworld war. "You are extraordinary," Nicholas murmured. The 3 words were delivered with a quiet, absolute reverence that completely short-circuited my defensive shields. My breath caught in my throat. I had spent my entire adult life having my intelligence diminished, my professional value reduced to a transactional necessity, by men who viewed me as nothing more than a tool. To hear the most powerful kingpin in the city validate my intellect with such profound sincerity was entirely intoxicating. My chest ached with a sudden, unexpected vulnerability. I looked away, staring back at the red dot on the screen, unsure of how to process the immense weight of his respect. Before I could formulate a response to the raw intensity in his gray eyes, the polite, distinctly human female voice of the central AI chimed smoothly from the concealed acoustic array in the ceiling. "Mr. Ricchetti, the transition cart has been positioned in the secondary corridor." The spell of intense, tactical concentration was broken. Nicholas pulled his gaze away from the monitors, his focus instantly snapping back to my physical state. He had not forgotten the severe somatic crash I had endured in the armored SUV. The absolute destruction of Dante Drago's surveillance hub was a priority, but my biological stability superseded it. "Remain here," he commanded softly. He turned and walked toward the heavy mahogany doors, his tailored suit shifting flawlessly over the lethal mechanics of his muscles. The reinforced timber doors parted silently as we approached, sliding shut silently behind him. I was left alone in the massive soundproofed acoustic library, the soft glow of the OLED screens illuminating the dark wood and casting long shadows against the walls. I leaned back in the leather chair, pulling the lapels of his heavy wool coat tighter around my chest. The silence was absolute. There were no blaring sirens, no rattling pipes, no heavy footsteps echoing in a crumbling hallway. Just the pristine, unbroken quiet of a gilded cage that I had actively chosen to lock myself inside. My fingers traced the smooth edge of my encrypted titanium USB key, grounding myself in the tangible reality of my survival. I was safe. For the first time in nearly a year, I didn't have to listen for the sound of someone trying to force their way into my home. The relief was so profound, it bordered on physical pain, a heavy, aching weight settling behind my ribs. A minute later, the doors hissed open again. Nicholas re-entered the room, pushing a sleek, brushed steel transition cart. Resting on the top tier was a covered silver cloche and a crystal carafe of water. He maneuvered the cart smoothly to the edge of the custom-built desk, bypassing my complex array of monitors, and removed the silver cover. The sensory contrast was violent. For the past year, my dietary intake had consisted entirely of cheap, expiring carbohydrates. Instant noodles consumed over a dripping sink, and stale coffee meant to keep my eyes open through the grueling double shifts. I had lived in a constant state of caloric deficit, my body cannibalizing its own reserves, just to keep my brain functioning, burdened by debts that made eating well an impossible luxury. The very idea of an actual nourishing meal had become a distant fantasy. The scent that wafted up from the pristine white porcelain bowl was rich, complex, and overwhelmingly savory. It was a high-caloric, perfectly seasoned bone broth, accompanied by delicate, thinly sliced cuts of lean protein and roasted winter vegetables. Beside it sat a thick slice of warm artisan bread resting on a linen napkin. It was exactly what a highly traumatized, Severely exhausted nervous system required to rebuild cellular energy without triggering nausea. Eat, Nicholas instructed. He did not phrase it as a suggestion. He poured a glass of water from the crystal carafe and set it next to the bowl. I looked at the food, my stomach suddenly twisting with a violent, painful cramp of acute hunger that I had been suppressing for hours. My hands were still shaking slightly as I reached out and picked up the heavy silver spoon. The metal felt cold against my skin, a sharp contrast to the steaming broth in the bowl. I took the first bite. The broth was incredibly hot, the rich, restorative heat spreading instantly down to my throat and blooming in the center of my chest. It felt like a physical lifeline. I closed my eyes, a small, involuntary sigh escaping my lips as the somatic recovery finally began to take hold. The trembling in my fingers smoothed out. The deep, aching chill in my bones began to recede, replaced by a heavy, lethargic warmth that made my eyelids flutter. I didn't realize how desperately I had been starving until the nourishment finally hit my system. Nicholas did not leave the room to coordinate his strike team. He did not retreat to a separate command center to wage his underworld war. He pulled a heavy leather armchair from the corner of the library and positioned it directly across the mahogany desk, remaining firmly within my immediate visual perimeter. He sat down, crossing his long legs with relaxed, predatory grace, and watched me eat. It was a deeply intimate, highly vulnerable dynamic. In my old life, eating was a rushed, defensive act, constantly interrupted by the chaotic demands of my past, or the paralyzing fear of an unexpected knock at the door. But here, under the unyielding gaze of the syndicate head, the simple act of consuming a meal felt profoundly safe. He was actively enforcing domestic warmth, utilizing the quiet, physical act of nourishment to rebuild the psychological boundaries that Dante Drago had shattered. He was proving, without a single word, that my basic human needs mattered to him. The broth is. It is incredible, I whispered, my voice sounding fragile in the still atmosphere. I took another small sip of the water, the cool crystal of the glass pressing against my lower lip. It is designed to stabilize, he replied smoothly, his gray eyes tracking the return of color to my pale cheeks. Your cortisol levels have been elevated for a sustained, highly toxic duration. We will regulate your physical environment until your sympathetic nervous system completely disengages. It was a clinical assessment delivered with intense, possessive care. Nicholas didn't offer empty platitudes. He didn't tell me I was safe now like a patronizing savior. He acknowledged the severe physiological toll my body had taken, and offered a calculated, structured pathway to healing. He was dismantling my trauma with the same methodical precision he used to govern his illicit empire. He wasn't ignoring the damage, he was actively treating it. I took another bite of the lean protein, my analytical mind still running in the background, unable to fully detach from the glowing red coordinates on the monitor beside my bowl. The meat was tender, perfectly cooked, melting on my tongue and flooding my system with much-needed energy. But the adrenaline of the discovery was still humming just beneath the surface of my skin. What happens to the facility? I asked, gesturing slightly, with the silver spoon toward showing the waterfront logistics hub. Dante has men stationed there. They are monitoring the frequency as we speak, waiting for me to make a mistake. Nicholas did not look at the monitor. He kept his focus entirely on me. The intensity of his stare was suffocating, yet entirely intoxicating. It was the look of a man who had claimed something as his own, and was prepared to destroy anyone who threatened it. In my world, he said, his resonance a low, gravelly vow that vibrated in the tranquil suite, there is a fundamental law regarding the people I protect. It is absolute. It is not subject to negotiation, nor is it bound by the bureaucratic delays of a legal system. He reached into his tailored jacket and withdrew a sleek encrypted communication device, a smaller, vastly more sophisticated version of the burner phones I normally analyzed. He pressed a single button on the side. Control, Nicholas said into the device, his tone shifting instantly from the quiet domesticity of the library to the cold, ruthless authority of an apex predator giving an execution order. The transformation was terrifyingly seamless. One moment he was the attentive guardian ensuring I was fed. The next, he was the Don of the Ricchetti Syndicate commanding his soldiers. Yes, sir, the control operator replied through the external speaker. The voice was crisp, professional, completely devoid of emotion. I am transmitting a set of coordinates to your terminal, the Waterfront Logistics Facility. It is an Eastern Crew surveillance hub operated by Dante Drago's contractors. Understood. Do we observe? No, Nicholas commanded, the single syllable falling like a physical weight in the room. He didn't hesitate. He didn't weigh the political consequences. You will deploy a full tactical breach, incinerate the hardware, sever their network access to the primary grid. If the contractors attempt to raise a weapon, you will neutralize them. But you will leave one man alive. One man capable of delivering a message back to Drago. What is the message, boss? Nicholas looked directly at me, his intense eyes meeting mine with an unyielding, absolute focus that completely anchored me to the leather chair. The air in the acoustic library seemed to thicken, charged with the sudden lethal voltage of his promise. Relay to him that the acoustic asset is under my roof. Nicholas stated softly into the comms, though his gaze never left mine. Ensure he understands that if he, or any operative associated with the Eastern crew, steps within a 10-mile radius of her digital or physical footprint again, I will not send an extraction team. I will burn their entire logistics network to the ground while they sleep. Do you understand? Loud and clear. The strike team is moving now. Nicholas terminated the connection and set the device face down on the mahogany desk. The sharp click of the plastic against the wood echoed in the quiet room. The finality of the order washed over me, leaving me breathless. I was accustomed to the slow, agonizing machinery of the regular world. The police reports that went nowhere. The restraining orders that were nothing more than useless pieces of paper waiting to be violated by men who thought they were above the law. The endless, terrifying vulnerability of being a woman standing alone against violent men with leverage. But Nicholas had just mobilized a private army to systematically dismantle a syndicate threat, within 3 minutes of me discovering it. He wasn't just shielding me, he was actively, ruthlessly striking back at the monsters in the dark on my behalf. He wasn't asking for my patience. He was delivering immediate, devastating justice. The unspoken retaliation pattern was not a myth. It was a tangible, devastating reality unfolding right in front of me. The men who had hunted me, who had terrified me into hiding for 8 months, were currently being eradicated by a force they could not possibly comprehend. Dante Drago had stalked me from the shadows, confident in his untouchable status, assuming I was nothing more than an isolated, disposable pawn. He had vastly underestimated the absolute territorial dominance of Nicholas Archetti. Tonight, Dante's entire surveillance network was burning to the ground simply because he had dared to look through my window in that one innocent selfie. I set the silver spoon down. The bowl of broth was half empty. My physical hunger fully satisfied, replaced by a profound, overwhelming sense of security that settled into my bones like a heavy blanket. I pulled the heavy lapels of his cedar-scented heavy wool coat tighter around my neck. The trembling that had plagued me for hours was completely gone. I felt steady, grounded, alive. They will never stop looking for the gap in the firewall, I said quietly. The forensic linguist inside me acknowledging the reality of the underworld war. I met his gaze directly, refusing to look away. If Dante knows I am here, he will attempt to bypass your digital perimeter. He will hire better contractors. He will use more sophisticated encryption. He knows exactly what I am capable of translating. Let him try, Nicholas replied, leaning back in the leather armchair. The faint, dangerous ghost of a smile returned to his features, a terrifying promise of violence wrapped in a bespoke suit. It was a look that promised absolute ruin for anyone who dared to challenge him. He is a blunt instrument attempting to breach a fortress designed by the most brilliant architect in the city. You have the servers, you have the access. You are no longer the prey, Maya. You are the apex. He stood up, his massive frame dominating the room with effortless grace. He walked around the edge of the desk, stopping just inches from my chair. He reached out, his long fingers gently brushing a stray lock of dark hair away from my cheek. The touch was incredibly tender, a stark, jarring contrast to the violent execution order he had just issued, yet it made perfect sense in the twisted logic of his protection. He wasn't asking for permission to touch me. He was simply claiming the space, offering a tactile reassurance that he was real, that this safety was permanent. Finish your meal, Nicholas ordered softly, his thumb lingering against my jawline for a fraction of a second before he pulled away. Then, you will sleep. Tomorrow, we will rewrite the entire security architecture of this syndicate together. Some codes don't have direct, simple translations, only heavy, complex structures of survival. I looked up at the man who had effortlessly bypassed my deadbolts, shattered my isolation, and handed me the keys to his empire. The cold, hyper-vigilant exhaustion of my miserable shadow life was permanently dead. The fear that had defined my every waking moment had been incinerated by the quiet, absolute authority of his presence. I didn't have to hide anymore. I didn't have to pretend I didn't exist. I was visible. I was valued. And as the custom-built silent heat sinks of the closed-loop computing hub purred softly in the background, the surgical blue light of the monitors casting long, steady shadows across the mahogany desk, I realized the absolute truth of my new reality. Wrapped in his unyielding protection, anchored by the hum of the machines that gave me back my power, I was finally, truly home. The surgical blue light of the monitors continued to cast long, steady shadows across the dark mahogany desk, but the frantic, jagged energy of my survival instinct had finally flatlined. The bone-deep exhaustion that Nicholas had accurately diagnosed was no longer a looming threat. It was an absolute physical reality. I sat perfectly still in the ergonomic leather chair, the empty porcelain bowl resting on the brushed steel transition cart beside me. The high caloric broth had stabilized the violent tremors in my hands, but the adrenaline debt was currently collecting its due. Nicholas remained standing just inches from my chair. He did not retreat. He did not check the encrypted communication device he had just used to order the systematic eradication of a syndicate hitman surveillance network. His entire focus was anchored exclusively on me. His pale eyes, focusing on my profile with a cold, analytical intensity, read the heavy droop of my eyelids and the faint, residual tension locking my shoulders beneath the luxurious weight of his cedar-scented heavy wool coat. "Your cognitive functions are shutting down," Nicholas stated softly. The baritone of his voice was a low, steady rumble that vibrated directly against my sternum. It wasn't a reprimand. It was a precise, medical observation delivered by a predator who understood exactly how much punishment a human nervous system could endure before catastrophic failure. "I need to verify the proxy logs," I whispered, my voice sounding incredibly thin in the vast acoustic perfection of the library. My fingers twitched, a stubborn, involuntary impulse to reach back toward the mechanical keyboard. If Dante's contractors attempt a counter-breach before your strike team incinerates their hardware, I have to trace the secondary IP relays. "No," Nicholas commanded. The single syllable fell into the quiet room with the unyielding weight of an iron vault closing. He didn't raise his voice a single decibel, but the absolute, crushing authority in his tone immediately severed my lingering paranoia. "The digital perimeter is secure," he continued, stepping slightly closer, closing the remaining fraction of space between us. "The logistics facility is currently burning to the ground. My tactical teams are executing the protocol exactly as ordered. You have dismantled their architecture, Maya. Your operational shift is over." He extended his right hand toward me. He had removed his bespoke leather gloves earlier, and his large callous palm was bare, radiating that same intense grounding thermal heat. I stared at his hand. For a woman who had spent the last 8 months treating every physical interaction as a potential threat, the gesture should have triggered a severe somatic recoil. My abusive ex-husband had weaponized physical contact, turning every touch into a precursor to violence or manipulation. But Nicholas Arquetti did not weaponize touch against me. He utilized it as an unbreakable structural tether. I reached out. My small, pale fingers slipped it into his grasp. His hand closed around mine with smooth, terrifying strength. He pulled gently, providing the exact mechanical leverage required to draw me up from the heavy leather chair. My damp canvas shoes met the thick sound-dampening Persian rug. As soon as I was vertical, the room tilted slightly. The heavy wool coat draped over my shoulders suddenly felt like a lead apron, dragging my exhausted frame downward. Nicholas did not let me fall. His left hand moved with blinding speed, the warm palm catching the side of my waist through the thick layers of cashmere and wool. He absorbed my shifting weight effortlessly, anchoring me to his side with the immovable stability of industrial concrete. "Lean on me," he murmured, his breath brushing the crown of my dark hair. I didn't argue. I didn't have the physical capital left to maintain my fierce independence. I let my shoulder press against the solid, tailored line of his charcoal suit jacket. We began to move out of the acoustic library. The sturdy hardwood doors slid open with a soft pneumatic hiss as we approached, responding to the invisible biometric sensors embedded in the penthouse architecture. We stepped out into the expansive, warmly lit central corridor. The contrast between the surgical blue light of my workstation and the soft golden ambiance of the living space was visually disorienting. To my left, the massive panes of floor-to-soiling bulletproof glass displayed the brutal reality of the Boston winter. The blizzard was escalating. The wind howled silently against the thick, reinforced panes, the driving snow creating a chaotic, swirling vortex of white over the dark harbor. It looked incredibly hostile. Not cold, not vulnerable, absolutely untouchable. Walking down the sprawling corridor, anchored firmly by Nicholas's hand on the small of my back, the shift in my reality felt just as visceral as the moment he had ushered me down into his heavily armored luxury SUV, waiting in the freezing rain. The transition was absolute. He had physically severed me from the freezing, unpredictable chaos of my past, pulling me into a sphere of absolute warmth and physical safety. The penthouse wasn't just an apartment. It was a high-altitude extension of that armored vehicle, a static fortress designed to withstand a siege. The structural integrity of this floor is rated for high explosive impacts. Nicholas observed quietly, reading my hyper-vigilant gaze as I stared at the massive glass panes. He matched his long, measured strides to my slow, faltering steps. The glass is a proprietary ballistic polymer, layered with a transparent titanium mesh core. The ventilation system operates on an independent, military-grade HEPA filtration loop. There is no physical or chemical vector by which the outside world can reach you here. He was feeding me raw, empirical data to soothe my traumatized nervous system. He understood that I didn't need romantic reassurances. I needed structural logic. I needed to know the mathematical probability of Dante Drago breaching this sanctuary was absolute zero. "It is a fortress," I whispered, my voice thick with exhaustion. "It is your sanctuary," he corrected smoothly. He guided me past the onyx bar and the slate fireplace, turning us in a secondary corridor that I had not yet seen. The lighting here was dimmer, warmer, casting long shadows against the polished, ported black marble floor. We stopped in front of a pair of heavy, soundproof doors. Nicholas placed his hand against a sleek biometric panel set into the dark wood. The lock disengaged with a soft, pneumatic hiss. He pushed the doors open and ushered me inside. The master suite was a sprawling, immaculate space that mirrored the aggressive, minimalist luxury of the rest of the penthouse. A massive, low-profile bed occupied the center of the room, draped in heavy, dark-toned linens that smelled faintly of cedar and pristine, high-altitude rain. The lighting was deeply recessed, casting a soft, amber glow that did not assault my exhausted retinas. Another wall of bulletproof glass overlooked the city, but thick, automated blackout curtains were currently drawn, sealing the room in complete, secure darkness. Nicholas led me to the edge of the bed. I sank onto the mattress. The memory foam immediately contoured to my weight, offering a yielding, supportive pressure that made my aching lumbar spine throb with relief. I sat there, my hands resting in my lap, suddenly acutely aware of my physical dishevelment. I was still wearing the cheap, pilling thrift store sweater and damp canvas shoes engulfed in his immensely expensive cashmere coat. I was a bruised, exhausted stray dragged into a palace of dark luxury. Nicholas did not ask me to change. He did not issue commands regarding my attire. Instead, he walked over to a sleek, dark wood console table, positioned near the heavily reinforced door. He opened a shallow drawer and extracted a heavy, matte black titanium case. He walked back to the bed and sat down beside me. The mattress barely dipped under his immense weight, a testament to its structural engineering, but the sheer gravity of his physical presence completely altered the barometric pressure of the room. He placed the titanium case on the dark linens between us. "Inside the safety of the vehicle earlier, I crushed your compromised hardware to prevent Dante from tracking the immediate digital ping," Nicholas stated, his baritone low and intensely serious. "But physical destruction is only the first layer of a true protocol. Your digital footprint required permanent eradication from the external grid." He flipped the dual steel latches of the case. They snapped open with a sharp, definitive click. He lifted the lid, revealing a sleek, heavy smartphone resting in a bed of high-density shock-absorbing foam. "While you were dismantling the Eastern Cruise surveillance network in the library, my cyber warfare division was systematically dismantling your past," Nicholas explained. He reached into the case and picked up the new device. They accessed the primary ISP servers. They permanently deleted the public Selfie post from the social media databases. They scrubbed the localized data caches, erased the metadata embedded in the image file, and completely wiped your IP history from the proxy relays. The photograph that exposed you no longer exists on any server on this planet. I stared at the black screen of the new phone, my chest tightening with a profound, staggering sense of awe. He hadn't just removed the physical threat from my door. He had reached into the vast, complex architecture of the internet and surgically excised the mistake I had made. He had weaponized his unlimited capital and technological dominance to rewrite my digital history, ensuring that the vulnerability could never be exploited again. "You deleted it from the source servers?" I murmured, the forensic linguist in me recognizing the staggering level of illegal access required to achieve that. "That requires circumventing federal encryption standards." "I am the standard." Nicholas replied flatly. It was not a boast. It was a terrifying statement of absolute objective fact. He held the sleek device out to me. "I have installed deep syndicate encryption protocols onto this device. It operates on an entirely closed, air-gapped cellular network that routes exclusively through my private satellites. It cannot be traced, it cannot be spoofed, and it cannot be intercepted by any law enforcement or rival intelligence agency." I hesitated for a fraction of a second, my trembling fingers hovering over the matte black casing. To accept the device was to accept my complete integration into his shadow empire. I was severing my last, fragile connection to the normal world and binding myself entirely to his closed system. I took the phone from his hand. The metal was cool, heavy, and perfectly balanced. "My sister," I whispered, the crushing weight of familial guilt suddenly surfacing through my exhaustion. "Alina. She was the only reason I posted that picture. I promised her I would check in. When she doesn't hear from me on my old number, her anxiety will spiral. She will assume my ex-husband found me. She will call the local police." Nicholas did not flinch at the mention of the authorities. He simply leaned forward, resting his forearms on his thighs. His gray gaze pinned me across the dim space with an unyielding, absolute focus. "She will not call the police," he said smoothly, "because you are going to send her a message right now. The device is already calibrated with a spoofed proxy identifier that mirrors your old number on her end. She will receive the text normally, but any reply she sends will be funneled through a heavily sanitized encryption tunnel before it reaches this hardware." He had anticipated my guilt. He had anticipated my sister's panic, and he had engineered a flawless, highly secure technological bridge to preserve her peace of mind without compromising my location. The level of meticulous, protective foresight was staggering. Family members are vulnerabilities, weak points. "A person hiding for their life learns never to offer up that sort of collateral," I said softly, the harsh, cynical rule of my survival spilling from my lips. "Alina is my only leverage. If Dante Drago, or my ex-husband, or any of the monsters out there figure out she is connected to me." No. The single word cut through my rising panic like a surgical scalpel. Nicholas reached out, his long fingers wrapping securely around my wrist, his thumb pressing firmly against my erratic pulse point. "Look at me, Maya." I forced my exhausted eyes to meet his. The cold, calculated intelligence that defined him as a ruthless kingpin was still there, but it was currently eclipsed by a dark, possessive intensity that took my breath away. "In my world, when I claim something as mine, I protect it absolutely," Nicholas stated, his voice a low, steady rumble that vibrated comfortably in the hushed space. "If we do this, if you become the architect of my empire, you are mine, fully, and I do not share, I do not let go. My perimeter does not end at the reinforced doors of this penthouse, it extends to anyone you value. Your sister is currently under the discreet, 24-hour surveillance of my most elite tactical operatives. If anyone, whether it is a syndicate hitman or your pathetic excuse for an ex-husband, steps within a 10-mile radius of her campus, they will cease to exist before she even registers their presence." A tear, hot and entirely involuntary, finally slipped free from the corner of my eye. It tracked a slow burning path down my pale cheek. It was not a tear of fear or of sorrow. It was the overwhelming physical release of a burden I had carried alone for far too long. I had spent my life terrified that my existence was a danger to the people I loved. Now, the most feared man on the eastern seaboard had just declared my family untouchable, backing his promise with a private army and unlimited wealth. Nicholas did not offer a polite tissue. He lifted his free hand, his bare thumb gently wiping the tear from my skin. The rough texture of his callus against my cheek was a stark, jarring contrast to the gentle precision of his movement. "Send the message," he murmured softly. I looked down at the encrypted device. I unlocked the screen with a swipe of my thumb. The interface was minimalist, displaying only a single, highly secure messaging application. I opened it and typed a short, clinical text to Elena. Project is running long. I have relocated to a secure corporate suite provided by my client. Do not worry, I will call you tomorrow. I love you. I hit send. The message vanished into the encrypted tunnel, mathematically sanitized and completely untraceable. I placed the heavy smartphone onto the dark wood of the bedside table. It is done, I whispered. Then your operational shift officially over, Nicholas declared. He stood up from the edge of the bed. I expected him to turn and leave. To return to his empire and leave me to sleep in the cavernous, silent suite. I instinctively tensed, bracing for the sudden absence of his grounding thermal heat, terrified that my somatic hypervigilance would immediately return the moment the heavy doors closed behind him. But Nicholas did not walk toward the doors. Instead, he unbuttoned his tailored charcoal suit jacket, shrugging the incredibly expensive garment off his broad shoulders with a fluid, relaxed motion. He draped it casually over the back of a heavy leather armchair, positioned in the far corner of the room, near the automated blackout curtains. He reached up and methodically unbuttoned the top 2 buttons of his crisp white dress shirt, loosening the dark silk tie at his throat. The slight dishevelment stripped away the rigid, corporate armor of the syndicate boss, revealing the lethal, coiled muscle of the apex predator beneath. He walked over to the leather armchair and sat down. He stretched his long legs out, crossing them at the ankles, and rested his arms on the thick armrests. He was establishing a physical perimeter within the room. He was initiating a silent vigil. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice barely a breath, my heart stuttering against my ribs at the profound, overwhelming intimacy of the gesture. "I am ensuring you sleep," Nicholas replied calmly. His metallic eyes met mine. He did not soften the blow. "Your nervous system has been severely traumatized. If you are left alone in a new, unfamiliar environment, your paranoia will override your exhaustion. You will lie awake, actively scanning the shadows for a threat that does not exist. I am removing that variable." He wasn't going to leave. He was going to sit in the corner of the room, awake and fully alert, acting as an immovable human shield while I slept. It was the ultimate, undeniable proof of absolute protection. "You have an empire to run," I protested weakly, though my heavy eyelids were already betraying my desperate need for rest. "You have a logistics facility, burning to the ground. You cannot simply sit in a chair all night to watch me." "I can do exactly as I please, Maya," he corrected softly, the faint, dangerous ghost of a smile touching his lips. "And right now it pleases me to ensure my most valuable asset achieves a deep, restorative REM cycle. The Empire will survive the night. Do not argue with me. Lie down." I didn't have the strength to argue. The sheer, overwhelming domestic warmth radiating from his protective stance completely dismantled my final, stubborn defense mechanism. I shifted backward on the massive mattress, pulling my legs up onto the dark linens. I didn't bother taking off the oversized outerwear. The scent of cedar and ozone embedded in the cashmere felt like a physical extension of his presence, wrapping around me in a tight, secure embrace. I curled onto my side, sinking deep into the memory foam. I looked across the room. Nicholas was perfectly still in the leather armchair, his powerful frame relaxed but intensely vigilant. The dim amber light caught the pale scar cutting through his left eyebrow, a quiet testament to the violence he was capable of unleashing to protect what was his. The night my ex-husband had forced me into the shadows was the night I began a solitary, terrifying war for survival. I had believed I was completely invisible, destined to fight the crushing weight of my debts and my trauma entirely alone. But standing in the freezing rain of my own despair, I had ultimately found the most dangerous man in the city. I closed my eyes. For the first time in 300 days, I didn't listen for the sound of shattering glass or heavy footsteps in the hallway. I only listened to the steady rhythmic sound of Nicholas Ricchetti breathing in the corner of the room. The cold was finally permanently dead. And as the profound, heavy darkness of true sleep pulled me under, I knew with absolute, empirical certainty that I was exactly where I belonged. The transition from extreme adrenal fatigue to a baseline of biological safety is a strange, profoundly delicate process. When I finally opened my eyes, the deep, restorative REM cycle the syndicate head had practically ordered me to achieve had completely run its course. For the first time in 300 agonizing days, my awakening was not triggered by a sudden, terrifying noise in the hallway, the phantom echo of shattering glass, or the crippling panic of an impending deadline. I simply woke up. My muscles, which had been locked in a rigid state of fight or flight for what felt like an eternity, were completely slack against the high thread count sheets. The massive master suite at the center of the penthouse was bathed in a soft, diffused morning light. The automated blackout curtains had silently retreated, revealing the sweeping, snow-covered panorama of the Boston Harbor through the wall of bulletproof glass. The chaotic, violent blizzard of the previous night had broken, leaving behind a stark, brilliant blue sky that felt entirely foreign to my miserable shadow existence. I shifted against the memory foam mattress, my sensory receptors slowly coming online. The physical exhaustion that had turned my bones to lead was gone. The somatic hypervigilance, the permanent knot of tension in my throat, the erratic, bird-like flutter of my heart, the metallic taste of fear, was completely absent. I analyzed my own biological baseline with the same clinical detachment I used to process a corrupted audio file. My pulse was steady. My breathing was deep and rhythmic. The heavy wool coat still draped securely over my small frame, trapping a cocoon of heat against my skin. Its scent of sharp winter ozone, cedar and expensive leather, was deeply embedded in my senses, a constant tactile reminder of the apex predator who had claimed my protection. I looked toward the far corner of the room. The heavy leather armchair where Nicholas had initiated his silent vigil was empty. A brief, involuntary spike of adrenaline hit my system, a residual ghost of my trauma. But before the panic could fully materialize, the heavy mahogany doors slid open with a soft, pneumatic hiss. Nicholas Arquetti stepped into the suite. He did not look like a man who had spent the entire night awake, coordinating the ruthless, systematic eradication of a rival syndicate's surveillance network. He was dressed in a fresh, perfectly tailored dark navy suit, the crisp, uncompromising lines of the fabric, emphasizing the immense breadth of his shoulders and the lethal coiled power of his frame. He moved with that same terrifying silent grace, carrying a transition cart of polished metal. Sitting on the surface were 2 delicate porcelain cups and a steaming French press. The mafia boss walked over to the edge of the mattress and set the tray down on the dark wood console table. He poured the dark, rich liquid and handed me a cup. The dark roast smelled of earth, smoke, and old money. The ceramic was incredibly warm against my cold palms. The sharp, complex aroma of perfectly roasted espresso instantly filled the space, chasing away the sterile clinical scent of the high-altitude room. It was a deeply domestic, grounding gesture from a man who orchestrated widespread violence for a living. I wrapped both hands around the cup, letting the thermal heat seep into my skin. "You didn't sleep," I murmured, my voice raspy from hours of silence. The kingpin took his own cup, the delicate porcelain looking absurdly fragile in his massive calloused hand. "I require very little sleep, Maya. My tactical teams, however, have been highly active throughout the night." He remained standing beside the bed, his tall frame blocking the harsh glare of the morning sun. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and withdrew a sleek, encrypted tablet, placing it face down on the dark linens between us. The waterfront logistics hub Dante Drago utilized is currently a smoldering pile of ash, the syndicate head stated, his baritone a low, resonant rumble that vibrated comfortably in the quiet room. The message was delivered to the surviving contractor exactly as I dictated. Drago has abandoned his perimeter. He has retreated entirely to the eastern seaboard, his surveillance network completely blinded, and his operational capacity crippled. I took a slow sip of the espresso. The caffeine hit my bloodstream, sharpening my cognitive focus, and my apartment? His ash-gray eyes locked onto mine. He did not soften the blow, he did not offer empty, patronizing reassurances or attempt to sugarcoat the brutal reality of our world. He spoke with the absolute, flat certainty of a commander delivering an objective tactical report. "Your apartment is compromised," he said softly, the weight of the statement dropping into the room like a heavy stone. "My extraction team returned to the site 2 hours ago. They systematically removed every piece of physical evidence that you ever existed in that space. The fake lease documents have been shredded. The cheap clothes in your closet were burned. The remaining electronics and corrupted hardware you left behind were incinerated. The walls and surfaces were scrubbed of your biometric footprint with industrial chemicals. By sunrise, Unit 4A was nothing more than an empty, rotting shell. You have absolutely no physical footprint left in this city." The finality of his words washed over me in a massive, crushing wave. I was entirely untethered. The miserable, freezing little box with the peeling yellow wallpaper and the dripping faucet, the only refuge I had managed to secure after fleeing my abusive ex-husband, was gone. The ghost identity I had spent 8 agonizing months building was dead. But the panic I expected to feel, the desperate, suffocating terror of being homeless and exposed, simply did not materialize. Instead, the predator stepped closer, the edge of his tailored trousers brushing against the heavy linens of the bed. He reached out, his long, bare fingers gently cupping the side of my face. His thumb traced the sharp line of my cheekbone, his touch incredibly warm and devastatingly tender. "You do not belong to the shadows anymore, Maya," he continued, his gaze dropping to my lips before locking back onto my eyes with a fierce, possessive intensity. "Your apartment is a pile of ashes, yes, but you are safe with me. You will never have to look over your shoulder again. You will never have to lie awake deciphering the sound of a footstep in a dark hallway. That miserable, freezing life is permanently over. I analyze human communication for a living. I know the exact phonetic cadence of a lie. I understand the subtle glottal tension of a broken promise. The microtremors in vocal cords when a man is attempting to manipulate a vulnerable target. When Nicholas told me I was safe with him, his pitch was perfectly level. His vocal cords were entirely relaxed. There was absolutely no physiological stress in his delivery. It was an empirical truth. The profound relief that hit my system was staggering. It was a physical tectonic shift, loosening the final, stubborn knots of defensive tension in my cervical spine. I looked up at him, really looked at him. This ruthless, terrifying mafia kingpin had not just extracted me from a tactical snare. He had completely dismantled my solitary war and placed his own massive, untouchable empire squarely on my front lines. The deep, unexpected sense of trust that suddenly bloomed in the center of my chest was absolute. A year of my life, a year of believing someone loved me, of planning a future that had just been incinerated, in front of 200 witnesses. When my ex-husband first showed his violent, true nature, I had learned the hard way that love was a fragile, toxic weapon used by weak men to enforce compliance. But the head of the Rocchetti syndicate was not offering fragile love. He was offering absolute, unyielding loyalty. He was offering a sovereign, impenetrable partnership where my intellect was revered, and my physical safety was a non-negotiable law of his universe. I leaned my cheek slightly into the warmth of his calloused palm, a silent, profound surrender of my independence. I didn't need to be invisible anymore. The most dangerous predator in the city was actively guarding my door, and for the first time in my life I felt entirely, overwhelmingly at peace. He let his thumb brush against my lower lip one final time before he slowly withdrew his hand. The absence of his touch left a cold patch on my skin, but the intense, calculated focus in his eyes promised that the distance was only temporary. The penthouse was merely a tactical extraction point, the syndicate head explained. Turning to pick up his espresso cup from the tray, he took a measured sip, his gaze sweeping over the panoramic view of the Boston skyline. "It is a highly secure facility, but it is located within the dense infrastructure of the city limits, which makes the perimeter inherently volatile. It is not a permanent home. My primary base of operations, the true fortress of the Rocchetti syndicate, is located 40 miles west, in the secluded, heavily forested hills of the surrounding territory." I set my own cup down, my analytical brain instantly processing the logistical shift. "You are moving me." "We are moving," he corrected smoothly, emphasizing the plural. "The standalone server cluster from the acoustic library is already being disassembled and transported via a heavily armed ground convoy. You and I will take the aerial route. I will not have you trapped in a glass box in the sky, Maya. You require a sanctuary with actual earth, secure grounds, and absolute, impenetrable privacy." An hour later, I was strapped into the plush leather seat of a private twin-engine armored helicopter, the heavy acoustic headset muttering with the crisp, encrypted communications of the pilot. The flight over the frozen, snow-blanketed landscape was breathtaking. The flight path avoided commercial radar, slicing through the freezing upper atmosphere with militaristic precision. I looked down at the sprawling frozen lakes and the jagged, snow-capped tree lines, my analytical mind processing the sheer logistical effort required to maintain this level of airspace dominance. Nicholas Rocchetti didn't just operate within the city. He commanded the very geography around it. The chaotic, claustrophobic grid of Boston gave way to vast, untouched expanses of white forests. Nicholas sat directly across from me in the cabin, his long legs stretched out, his presence a constant, grounding anchor against the vibration of the rotors. When the helicopter finally began its descent, the sheer, staggering scale of his true power revealed itself. We were descending toward a sprawling, heavily fortified private estate. The property was completely insulated by hundreds of acres of dense, old-growth pine forest, acting as a massive natural acoustic and visual barrier. As we banked lower, I could see the formidable, 12-foot-high wrought iron gates and the thick, reinforced stone walls encircling the inner compound. Highly trained, tactical operatives in winter gear patrolled the perimeter, their suppressed rifles visible, completely neutralizing any possibility of a ground assault. Yet, despite the lethal, military-grade security infrastructure, the architecture of the estate itself was profoundly beautiful. It was a massive, historic stone manor, featuring dark slate roofs, sweeping arched windows, and tall brick chimneys billowing thick, white wood smoke into the freezing air. It was a perfect physical manifestation of the kingpin himself, an exterior of absolute, unyielding violence, guarding a core of deep, luxurious domestic warmth. The helicopter touched down gently on a heated, snow-melted helipad, positioned near the rear gardens. The rotors began to power down, the deafening roar fading into a high-pitched whine. The mafia boss unbuckled his harness and stepped out onto the tarmac. He turned, the brutal winter wind whipping the lapels of his dark suit, and extended his hand to me. I took it, stepping out of the cabin and into the freezing air, the heavy cashmere coat he had given me last night, wrapping at me in an impenetrable shield of heat. As we walked toward the heavy oak double doors of the manor, the armed tactical guards lining the pathway did not just stand at attention. They lowered their heads in a sharp, synchronized display of absolute respect, not just to their leader but to me. I was stepping inside my highly secure new environment not as a captive asset, but as the recognized architect of their intelligence network. The heavy oak doors opened, and we stepped into the grand foyer. The sensory transition was immediate. The ambient air was incredibly warm, smelling deeply of crackling cedar wood, old parchment, and polished mahogany. The floors were rich, dark hardwood covered in thick, woven rugs that silenced our footsteps. "You are safe here," Nicholas stated quietly, unbuttoning his suit jacket. "Dante Drago cannot reach this coordinate. No one can." He placed his hand on the small of my back, guiding me past a sweeping grand staircase and down a wide, beautifully lit corridor. He pushed open a set of heavy, brass-handled doors, leading me into a massive 2-story private study. A roaring fire crackled in a massive stone hearth, positioned perfectly in front of a wall of sweeping windows. Overlooking the snow-covered gardens was a sprawling, custom-built workstation, already pre-wired to receive my servers. But he did not lead me to the computers. He guided me to the center of the room, toward a heavy mahogany coffee table. Lying on the polished surface was a single, thick leather-bound folder. He picked it up and held it out to me. "Competency is a two-way street, Maya," the Predator murmured, his baritone vibrating with a dark, lethal satisfaction. "You utilized your intellect and your spectral algorithms to dismantle Dante Drago's surveillance hub and save my men. I utilized my forensic accountants and my legal leverage to systematically dismantle the final, lingering remnants of your past." My pulse kicked into a rapid, uneven rhythm. I took the heavy leather folder from his hands and slowly opened the cover. The first document was a deeply encrypted printout from the mainframe of Boston General Hospital. It was a detailed ledger of the crushing, catastrophic medical debt I had incurred trying to keep my mother alive before she passed. The exact $47,000 burden that had forced me into the shadows, terrified of collection agencies and wage garnishments. I stared at the bottom line. The balance was 0. I scanned the transactional codes running down the margin. The alphanumeric sequences were flawless. The routing numbers verified a complete external buyout. It was an empirical, undeniable financial fact. The debt was purchased by a corporate shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. At 3 o'clock this morning, Nicholas explained smoothly, his eyes tracking the shock registering on my face. It was completely liquidated and permanently erased from the hospital's registry. You owe nothing to anyone in this world except me. My breath hitched painfully. The invisible, suffocating chain that had dragged me down for years was simply gone, vanished with a single stroke of his unlimited capital. I turned to the second document. The air in the study suddenly felt incredibly thin. It was a copy of a federal RICO indictment, heavily stamped with the seal of the Department of Justice, accompanied by a staggering stack of financial exposure ledgers. At the top of the indictment was the full legal name of my abusive ex-husband. He was a coward who relied on physical intimidation and corrupt, low-level police contacts to enforce his toxic dominance, the syndicate head stated, his voice dropping into a cold, ruthless register that lacked any trace of mercy. He hid his assets in fraudulent corporate accounts while he terrorized you. My forensic accountants bypassed his pathetic firewalls, compiled a comprehensive dossier of his embezzlement, wire fraud, and illegal gambling debts, and anonymously delivered the unredacted ledgers to the federal authorities 3 hours ago. I stared at the photograph of the man who had left me bruised and broken, the man who had forced me to flinch at every loud noise. His face on the printed dossier was pale, stripped of all the terrifying authority he used to wield over me in our cramped kitchen. The columns of numbers below his picture aligned with devastating clarity. I traced the precise accounting of his offshore accounts. Recognizing the exact money laundering structures my forensic algorithms were designed to catch. My ex-husband thought he was untouchable behind his cheap intimidation tactics, completely unaware that his digital footprint was fundamentally sloppy. The Racketti Syndicate's accountants had mathematically dismantled his entire life in a matter of hours. His assets are completely frozen, Nicholas continued, stepping closer, his massive frame radiating an intense protective heat. His corrupt police contacts have abandoned him to avoid federal prosecution. He was arrested by tactical FBI agents at dawn. He is currently sitting in a maximum security federal holding cell, with absolutely no possibility of bail. He is financially ruined, legally neutralized, and permanently caged. He will never, ever be able to reach you again. The tears I had refused to cry for a year finally spilled over my lashes, tracking hot, silent paths down my cheeks. It was the ultimate, devastating poetry of vigilante justice. My ex-husband, a monster who had thrived on volume, shattered glass, and physical violence, had been utterly annihilated by a quiet, calculated transfer of digital files orchestrated by the man standing beside me. The kingpin reached out, his large hands gently gripping my shoulders, pulling me firmly against the solid, unyielding wall of his chest. I dropped the leather folder onto the table and buried my face in his tailored suit, my hands clutching the expensive wool of his lapels as a profound, shattering sob of pure relief tore through my throat. He wrapped his massive arms entirely around me, enveloping my trembling frame in a cocoon of absolute, unbreakable safety. He settled his chin on the top of my head, his large hand smoothing down the length of my dark hair in a steady, rhythmic motion. In my world, when I claim something as mine, I protect it absolutely, Nicholas whispered fiercely against my hair, the vibration of his chest sinking deep into my bones. If we do this, if you become the architect of my empire, you're mine. Fully.